Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN WhatIf, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Returned with a Haunted Mind? A special shout out to the original creator, ohmytheon. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Uraraka woke up falling. Or at least to the sensation of falling. She jerked awake in her large bed, her legs and arms flailing as she was snatched out of the nightmare. For a brief moment, she was tangled in a sea of blankets and sheets and thought she'd actually fallen into the choppy water, but then a cool breeze and the sounds of the city blew in from her open window and she stilled. She stared at the ceiling for a minute before she slid her hands over her face and took a deep breath. By the time she pulled her hands away and opened her eyes, her heart had stopped pounding in her chest. It had been almost a month since she last had the dream. Why had it come back out of the blue? She had thought it might finally leave her alone, but no, it came back to her last night, so unforgiving. Even now, it clung to her desperately, hanging in the corner of her mind as if afraid she might forget it completely. She had to get up. She had to get out of bed. She had to get on with her day. Like she did every morning she had off work, Uraraka took a long, hot shower first. She took her time with her hair and with washing herself, like she could scrub away anything with a loofah. After that, she made herself breakfast in her small but cozy kitchen while the radio played in the background. She walked around her apartment aimlessly in a pink bathrobe and worn-through slippers drinking a cup of tea. Only when she caught sight of her calendar did she come to a halt. It was his birthday today. As if on cue, the phone rang, forcing Uraraka to look away. She should answer it, but she knew what it would be about, even if she didn't know who exactly was on the other end. She waited for the answering machine to pick it up, her single voice telling the caller to leave a message, and then listened as Tsu left a voicemail. "Hey, Ochako, I was calling to see if you wanted to have lunch," her best friend said on the machine. "No sense in lying. You shouldn't be alone today. Call me back please, or I'll try again later." That was Tsu for you, straight and to the point. She always said what was on her mind, even if it made other people uncomfortable. Uraraka didn't mind. Tsu wouldn't be the only one calling today, but she would be one of the few who would be open about why. It didn't matter what any of her friends said, she'd know what they were trying to do. It was sweet, truly, but she couldn't let herself get wrapped up in this. More than anything, she was desperate for things to be normal. Deep down, she knew her attempts to make it so during the day would only make it worse for her come tonight. She'd probably call Tsu babbling through tears, but Uraraka wanted to at least pretend like she was strong enough to handle this on her own, even if she didn't have to. Besides, weren't they suffering too? Weren't they sad as well? She should tend to their grief. She was being selfish. Later. She'd call Tsu back later, but for now, Uraraka went about the rest of her morning routine. She took a walk around the quiet neighborhood she'd moved into 2 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was very nice in her opinion and low in crime, almost like villains actively stayed out of the area. She ran errands, going to the bank and the farmer's market, smiling at neighbors and making friendly small talk with the vendors. The sun shined, and everyone was so happy. However, when she came home to a silent and empty apartment, no amount of natural light could lift the dark cloud brewing in her mind. She dropped the bags and sunk down into a crouch with her back pressed against the front door, covering her face as if to shield herself. The phone rang again, probably had been ringing while she was out since she turned her cell off, and Uraraka waited to hear a close friend's concerned voice. Would it be Ida this time or Momo? Maybe it would be Hatsum or even Todoroki. It was none of them. Instead, it was Bakugo. "Hey, Uraraka, you better be decent because I'm gonna be over there in like 5 minutes, Bakugo's voice said with all the delicacy of a wrecking ball. "We're going day drinking." There was no preamble. No, "Are you doing okay?" or "Do you need some company?" or "It'll be alright." It was just plain old Bakugo blowing his way in. He'd never changed in that respect. When it came to any defensive walls she might have put up, he blew them up and stepped right over the rubble, like they weren't even there, like they didn't matter to him. Uraraka could be mad, probably should be mad, but it felt nice not to be treated like glass. Just as he warned, The doorknob rattled a few minutes later and swung open. Having stood and cleaned herself up, Uraraka was putting the items from her errands away in the pantry, but stopped to gawk in confusion as Bakugu stepped inside her place and kicked the door shut behind him. "Excuse me," she greeted incredulously, "but I don't remember giving you a key." "You didn't," Bakugu simply told her, like that was all she needed to know. Definitely not. Him having a key to her place was a new development as far as she was concerned. He rolled his eyes. "I made a second copy of it like 10 months ago. During the dark days when everyone acted like they couldn't leave her alone for more than a day. No one else had stolen her keys to make a copy as far as she knew. Never used it before though. Stupid thing acted like it didn't want to work at first. A part of her wanted to hold out her hand and tell him to hand it over. Another part of her realized it would be futile. He didn't have a backup just in case she did demand it. Not that it mattered in the end. He could do whatever he wanted, and he'd done it out of concern. It wasn't like he came over all the time or something. "That what you're wearing?" Bakugu asked as he sat down on one of the stools at the counter that separated the kitchen from the living room. She had thought it looked cute when first looking for apartments. Someone could sit down and chat with whoever was in the kitchen or living room. Uraraka looked down at her outfit, black leggings with a long, faded red sweatshirt that hung over her shoulders and a black sports bra showing. It was a lazy outfit to match her slow-going day. She peered at Bakugu shrewdly. "Yes, what's wrong with it?" "Nothing," Bakugu replied with a grunt, continuing to eye her strangely. "Do you want me to change?" Bakugu waved a dismissive hand. "No, I don't give a shit what you wear." Then why the hell had he brought it up? Sometimes, he drew attention to the smallest details and made her think twice over nothing. Whatever. She liked this outfit so she was wearing it. After all, it wasn't like they were going to some fancy restaurant. "You done?" "Yeah." Uraraka turned to face him. "So where are we going?" "It's a surprise." Uraraka huffed. "So the same place as usual." "Got it?" The fact that she hadn't fought him at all was either a testament to how tired she was or proof she didn't really want to be alone. It wasn't the first time she and Bakugu had hung out like this, but it wasn't a weekly thing. He was off doing his own hero thing and she was doing hers. They had different lives and lived in different cities, although he wasn't far away. One surprising thing was that they never crossed each other's paths accidentally anymore. Every interaction between them was intentional and initiated by him, but he had become a normal part of her life. They didn't call each other daily and sometimes she didn't hear from him for a week, but then he'd shoot her a text, she'd email him an article, or they just found themselves at lunch and that was that. It wasn't an easy friendship, it never was with Bakugu, but it was something consistent. Pleasant. The fact that Bakugu never truly changed comforted her, even if he was different from when they were in school. She wouldn't say he was soft, but he wasn't as sharp around the edges anymore. He could still be cutting when he wanted, and she didn't doubt his temper for a second, but he'd learned how not to blow up at the drop of a hat. They walked half a mile down the street to a reasonably nice bar. It had nice outdoor seating and a surprisingly large selection of craft beers and sake. Their food was even good. She had found the place shortly after moving here while exploring the area. According to Bakugu, it was the only decent place in her neighborhood. If they had lunch or dinner, it was either here or somewhere by his place or further in the city. For July, it wasn't uncomfortably hot, so they got a table outside. Bakugu immediately ordered for them. "We need 2 orders of gyozo and your most expensive bottle of sake." "Scratch that. Make it 2 sakes." "Bakugu!" Uraraka gasped. "What?" Bakugu scoffed as the server scurried away. "I'm not drinking shit sake." Uraraka's cheeks burned a little pinker. "It's what? I make a boatload of money. This is nothing." As usual, Bakugu wasn't modest, but he wasn't outright bragging either. It was simply the truth. In the top 10, he was more than well off. She admittedly made good money as well, enough to support herself happily and give her parents a comfortable life, but old habits died hard. The implication that he was paying for all this didn't escape her. He wouldn't say that outright either, but if she so much as moved to pull out her wallet, he'd snap at her. This was him being nice. Helpful. Caring. A friend. She took it, knowing today was as big a deal for him as it was for her, even if he wouldn't admit it. He wouldn't tell her the exact truth, and she wouldn't force it out of him. When their drinks arrived, along with 2 waters, Bakugo shoved 1 sake bottle over to her side of the table and then opened his to pour himself a cup. His courtesy extended as far as paying and nothing more, but it only made her smile. "What are you even doing here, Bakugo?" she asked. "I'm drinking," Bakugo replied almost childishly. When Uraraka set the bottle down and gave him a look, he huffed out a sigh. "You know why? I can take care of myself." "I know that." Bakugo pointed a finger at her. "But here's what's gonna happen. We're gonna avoid the subject, get drunk, and then talk about him. You're gonna cry yourself out. I'm gonna make you laugh, carry your drunk ass home, and put you to bed. Finally, you're gonna thank me and go the fuck to sleep." It wasn't funny in the slightest. This night was going to end with her in tears. She didn't like admitting that. Hearing it said out loud made her hackles raise. "Do you think I'm so weak that I'll cry all over you?" "I'm not underestimating your strength, Uraraka," Bakugo told her bluntly. She didn't think he would ever use her given name. She'd have a heart attack if he did. "You're one of the strongest person I know. Anyone else would have fallen apart and crashed, but not you." When the appetizers arrived, Bakugo picked up his chopsticks and pointed them at her accusingly. "Now you better eat because I'm ordering a stupid amount of food." Just like that they switched gears. It was easy to do with Bakugo, who could drive a conversation like he would a sports car, completely in control and at breakneck speed. He delved easily into his most recent hero activity, going from a multiple villains takedown to his complaint about a sidekick he loathed but seemingly kept around so he could complain about him. Bakugo was the kind of guy that could talk about himself a lot, and you were somehow grateful. It was entertaining, but mostly, Uraraka didn't want to talk about herself right now. She wanted the blissful ignorance that came with listening to someone who could make the world spin around them. She enjoyed his stories. They were always peppered with colorful language and vivid imagery. He immersed her in his world and swept her away from everything else. They were on their 2nd bottle of sake with more appetizers on the way, and Uraraka hadn't even blinked. She sat there raptured, laughing at inappropriate moments that made him gripe and throwing in teasing comments that brought a smirk to his lips. It was an easy flow. She always forgot that until they were in these moments. That it could be easy. That she could breathe. Even with him. "I saw on the news what you did last week," Bakugo said abruptly. His cheeks were pinker than he would admit, the sake finally taking its toll on him, but she knew she was worse. Evening was almost upon them. They'd been here for so long. The sun was starting its slow descent behind the city skyline. The orange haze made Bakugo glow like fire, his sandy hair and red eyes sticking out even more than usual. Uraraka smiled shyly into her glass of water. "It wasn't much. It was fucking cool is what it was," Bakugo corrected. "You saved 10 people from a burning building and then caught the bastard that started it. Fucking cool." Deep down, Uraraka knew she had done well. After consuming a terrible amount of alcohol over the span of a few hours, she could even admit she was proud of herself. However, it was hard to feel that way when the one person who mattered the most, the one save she'd needed to make, had slipped right from her fingertips. Not literally, of course. She hadn't touched him at all, missing him by mere centimeters. She could still feel the swish of empty air when she desperately reached out for him. She had to save those people. She had to save everyone. She had to make up for who she hadn't saved. And she hadn't. She lost him. She'd missed him and fallen out of the sky to catch him, and she still. Oh, it was happening. Just as Bakugo told her it would. Despite being knee-deep in drinking, Bakugo spotted the sudden shift in her demeanor, warning him it was finally time. Her eyes dropped to her hands in her lap, and he set his cup on the table and leaned back in his seat. She wished she hadn't drank so much. She didn't want to talk about it like this. She wouldn't be able to control herself, yet she wouldn't have talked about it at all if she wasn't in this state. Uraraka could go weeks without talking to anyone about it until a reporter asked her how Uravity was faring after the devastating loss of Deku. "I know it's been almost a year," Uraraka mumbled, her voice so damn small, "but I still miss him." Bakugo stayed silent for once. It was her time to talk. This entire day was her time to talk, but he'd filled up the space until she was ready. It doesn't happen often anymore," But sometimes I forget he's gone. I'll come home, expecting to smell takeout and smoke from when he attempted to cook a fancy meal and failed, or I'll roll over, half awake, and reach out for him, and there's nothing. He's not there. It's like he was never there to begin with. Any of her other friends would have reached out to hold her hand, switch to the seat next to her, get up and wrap their arms around her shoulders. Bakugo did none of those things. He stayed in his seat, watching her silently, and listened. His face was remarkably passive considering who he was, his eyes unreadable. Most people didn't think Bakugo was capable of patiently listening, but she knew better. There was a quiet before the worst of storms, and this one was hers. He was this huge part of my life, and not just because we were. Uraraka rubbed her eyes. And when he was gone, he was gone. I didn't even get the chance to say goodbye. He didn't let me. After 11 months, she didn't know whether to be angry or upset anymore. He'd done what he did because he was a hero. It was who he was. He saved her life because she couldn't save his. In his eyes, if his fate was sealed in order to save hers, then that was that. There was no other option. He had been ready to die to save someone else. But it wasn't fair. He was more important than her. His place in the world was more than hers could ever be. The 10 people she saved from a burning building was nothing compared to the 100 he'd saved during an earthquake. She would never be the hero he had been, yet he'd still sacrificed himself to ensure she would live. And I'm just expected to move on with my life, Uraraka said, tears slipping down her face. Just as Bakugo had said, she was going to cry in public. How humiliating. Did you see that article online the other day? Oh, the one about whether or not you were dating that pro-hero. Kaima would. Bakugo wrinkled his nose in distaste. A bit old for you, isn't he? It was a brief attempt to lighten the mood and Uraraka made to laugh, but then she started to cry instead, so all in all, a bit of a fail. She appreciated it though. Fuck what they have to say. No one expects you to do anything except live. Take all the time you need. Never date again. Who gives a fuck? That's easy for you to say, Uraraka mumbled. You apparently have a new lay every week? Bakugo rolled his eyes. That's fucking stupid. He smirked at her. It's every other week. That half laugh / half cry slipped out of her again. She couldn't react any other way. Bakugo didn't snap at her for it, but he didn't pity her either. There was no poor little Uraraka lost her boyfriend coming from him. It was understanding that there were some chasms that couldn't be filled. Sometimes they had to be climbed. He was supposed to be the greatest hero there ever was, Uraraka whispered. It was a testament to how much he had grown that Bakugo didn't respond to that statement at all. And I couldn't save him. I couldn't do anything. Bullshit, Bakugo snapped, not meanly. You nearly died trying to save him. You literally plummeted in a free fall in an attempt to reach him again. The only reason you didn't kill yourself trying to save him was because he had the foresight to see how blind you were to yourself. They'd gone over this before, but they needed to again, one more time. She knew he was right. She knew she was being irrational. But she needed to hear it said once more. If it's anyone's fault, it's mine for not aiming right. I couldn't get you to where you needed to be to reach him in time. A spike of panic flashed through Uraraka, a painful tug on her heart. He had never said anything like that before, only that it wasn't her fault. Bakugo, you did your very best. You did everything you could. Bakugo tipped his head back and closed his eyes. Did I though? I keep asking myself if I could have done more. Maybe if I'd gone out there with you, maybe if I'd been able more damage to that damn villain so that Deku wouldn't have had to use everything he had against him midair over a fucking ocean. He sighed and leaned forward, looking terribly uncomfortable at having opened up. All I could do in the end was make sure that you didn't go under too. That's what he wanted. I knew it the second he used the last bit of his strength to push you away from the water right before he hit it. That was the nightmare though, wasn't it? That they had done everything they possibly could have done to save him and they had still failed. What kind of heroes did that make them? The moment Deku had leapt from the cliff, the blast off so strong that it had knocked them all back, Uraraka had known that nothing was going to be the same. It was either stop the villain now or let the city explode. They'd watched from their pathetic spots on the ground, covered in blood, sweat, and mud, as Deku collided fist first like a rocket into the villain and exploded with a power that none of them would ever be able to grasp. There had only been a moment of cheer and relief before they had realized that Deku was falling towards the ocean and falling fast. He was always falling in her dreams and, just as she hadn't that night, she could never reach him then. I keep thinking that one day I'll wake up and it'll just be normal that I'm by myself. Uraraka bit her lip. One day I'll be able to put on my suit and not question myself about whether I'm worthy enough. Bakugo bolted forward in his seat so fast that he bumped into the table, the empty sake bottles and their glasses clinking as they trembled in the wake of his anger. Don't you ever fucking question yourself like that, okay? You're an incredible hero. Deku knew that. You could tell that by the way he looked at you like you were the fucking moon and stars. When she didn't look totally convinced, he clenched his hands into fists on top of the table. You had your whole world turned upside down and most people would have shattered. 2 weeks after, you went back to work, back to saving lives, back to kicking ass. I'm still pissed at you for that. You needed way more time. I couldn't sit around and do nothing. Uraraka told him hotly, tears flooding her eyes again. I couldn't just stand there and act like the world had stopped turning, even if it felt like it had for me. That's not the kind of hero Deku was, and I wasn't going to let it be me. There were still people that needed to be saved, needed to be helped, and I promised myself that I would do that for him. That I'd do it for me, to prove that I was worth it. There was a shadow over Bakugo's face, one that she couldn't quite place, as he said in an uncharacteristically quiet voice, "You've always been worth it." He knew that right from the start. The words were spoken with no less aggression than usual despite how quiet he was. But they were just the right things to say. Uraraka could feel the walls bursting inside of her, punctured by such a simple statement. She curled her legs up in the chair so she could wrap her arms around them and press her face into her knees. Tears spilled out of her eyes and he let her cry. She didn't care if there were people around them. She didn't care if anyone she knew saw her. She didn't care if the paparazzi showed up and snapped pictures of her weeping and made some ridiculous tabloid, although she was certain Bakugo would blow a gasket and physically haul them away. She just let the tears come until they stopped. Eventually they did. As all things did, her tears came to an end. When it happened, she took a deep breath and lifted her face, the cool breeze of the evening chilling the tears on her face. Bakugo took one look at her and screwed up his face. "You look like your face is melting." "It's my makeup, you idiot," Uraraka told him. "Next time be prepared for emotional shit and wear waterproof makeup." Despite everything, the pain, the absence, and the longing for something far gone, Uraraka felt a little lighter. She also felt the beginnings of a headache, but that was usually what happened after drinking and a heavy cry spell. Bakugo pushed a water towards her and she accepted it. Gratefully. "You're shit at comforting, you know." "Good thing I'm just here to drink," Bakugo responded. "Now go clean your face before people start to think that I broke up with you or something." Uraraka thought to comment on him not caring about what people thought, but agreed that she did probably look like shit. Besides, a splash of water against her face would help her feel fresher. She hurried to the bathroom so she could fix herself up, fishing out her phone in the process. The amount of missed calls and unanswered text messages made her cringe, but truth be told, she'd forgotten all about it while they'd been talking. The first and only person she responded to was Tsu, who she knew would spread the word for her. "Sorry I haven't answered any of your calls." "I'm fine." "So, are you sure? You haven't answered anyone. We've been worried." "Again sorry. I've been busy. Had my phone turned off." "So, busy?" "Been with Bakugo for most of the day." "So, explains why he never answered our texts. We just thought he was being an ass." That made Uraraka giggle a little, though it brought a few tears to her eyes as well. Everyone was handling this their own way. She should have talked to everyone earlier, but it had just felt so daunting. The idea of telling all her friends that she was fine, it was hard but she would make it. No, she didn't need them to come over, it had been overwhelming. And then Bakugo had blown in and just swept her away from all of it like it was nothing, and he didn't care what everyone else thought they should do for her. Still, she felt guilty for ignoring them. Her friends were hurting too. This death hadn't affected only her. It would be a day late, but she would talk to them tomorrow. Maybe it was the alcohol flooding her veins, giving her a false sense of confidence, but she felt like tomorrow was going to be a new day. Like she was going to wake up and know in her heart that, no, things would never be the same again and she would always miss Deku and love him too, but she would be the hero he knew she was and she would smile for real when she thought back to him. When Uraraka returned to the table, Bakugo was pouring the last bit of their sake into her cup. "Oh no, I can't." He raised an eyebrow and pushed the glass towards her. "I can't." She laughed a little. "Did you see how I was walking over here?" "Yeah, not wobbly enough," Bakugo countered, putting all the pressure on her. She concentrated on the cup, picked it up, and then drank it. Granted, it wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel woozy. He grinned at her, all teeth and vicious, and then stretched back in his seat like a cat, his t-shirt raising up to expose skin. "That's much better." Uraraka eyed him and put her hands on her hips, which might have been a little intimidating if she wasn't swaying a little on the spot. "Trying to get me drunk to take advantage of me?" Bakugo stood up slowly, as if he had nowhere else he'd rather be than right in her space, and said, "Who says I need to get you drunk first?" in such an outrageously suggestive low tone that Uraraka burst out laughing. The alcohol made it so much worse. She felt like she was shooting from one emotion to the other, but this one she embraced. It felt good to laugh. It had felt good to cry in all honesty. She'd been hiding from it all day, but now that she'd done it and it was out in the open, she felt relieved. She barely caught sight of the checkbook on the table, already taken care of, before Bakugo all but pushed her out of the bar so she wouldn't try to sneak a peek at the damage. He knew her too well. Unfortunately, he had also known that that last bit of sake would do her in. The walk home would have been painful if not for the cool breeze that brushed against her. They did it in silence, him with his hands in his pockets and her with her hands clutching the strap of her purse. More than likely it was because both of them needed to focus on walking without looking like a couple of drunk idiots, which they probably did anyways. Bakugo was doing a pretty good imitation at not being drunk, but his steps were sluggish and his eyes kept sweeping over to her like he was making sure she was still standing. By the time they reached the steps of her apartment, Uraraka found herself groaning and slumping against him. Her eyelids were so heavy and she was so tired. Her mind screamed at her to just drift off where she stood. She didn't want to walk up the stairs. She was only on the second floor, but it seemed so far away. Maybe she could get away with sleeping in her car. That seemed like a reasonable idea right now. "I knew this would happen," Bakugo sighed, even though it was his fault for getting her this drunk in the first place. She turned to tell him that when he bent down and slid his arms underneath her, picking her up like she was nothing and holding her bridal style in his arms. Uraraka let out a tiny squeak. "I told you that I was gonna have to carry your drunk ass home." The first 2 steps he took were far too wobbly and she wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her face into his shoulder, almost certain that they were going to fall, but then he tightened his grip on her, tensed up his body, and made quick work of the rest, powering through it by sheer will. At her door, he once again used his copy of her key to let them in and kicked the door shut. Once inside, she thought he'd let her down, which seemed like a terrible idea since her legs were jello and she felt out of it from hanging in the air, but he didn't. He gripped her just a little tighter as if to let her know that he wasn't done and, just a tad bit drunk, she didn't fight it. Instead, he slowly made his way through her dark apartment until he reached her bedroom and carefully laid her down on her bed. It was far too gentle for someone as chaotic as him, but maybe it was the alcohol, dulling his emotions for once. As Bakugo grumbled about her always leaving her damn window open for any old villain to crawl through and closed it for her, Uraraka opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling, suddenly remembering how she had done the same thing this morning after waking up from the nightmare about Deku's fall and her twice failure to touch him in time. "I had the dream again last night." A breath of air escaped from Bakugo as he returned to her bedside. "Do you want me to call Tsuyu or?" She shook her head. "No, I'll be fine, just..." "I'll stay," Bakugo said in a decisive tone. "On the couch, I mean. Can't really drive right now anyways." They looked at each other for a beat too long. Uraraka knew it was too long and Bakugo surely didn't look at anyone that long, but alcohol had a funny way of making barriers seem non-existent. The urge to reach out and squeeze his hand hanging at his side was so sudden that she didn't even think about not doing it. She felt him tense up at first when she did so, but then he loosened up and squeezed back before she pulled her hand away. Uraraka raised an eyebrow at him and he gave her a questioning look. Are you just going to stand there? I'm not sleeping in this. Bakugo narrowed his eyes at her for a second, a sharp quip on his tongue, before he decided against it and walked towards the door. Hey, Bakugo. He stopped to glance back at her and she gave him a tired smile, the moonlight from her window casting a faint glow on her. Thank you. Whatever, angel face, Bakugo dismissed, though she saw the pleased look on his face. She didn't bother telling him where. The blankets and pillows were for him to use. He knew where they were. Having done this a few times before, usually when Bakugo was in a foul mood and needed someone to vent to that wasn't Kirishima, he was at least a little familiar with her couch. She took a deep breath as she sat up in bed. Round face. Angel face. Bakugo was always full of nicknames for everyone that he came in contact with. Back at you. It had been because he'd never bothered learning names and then it just stuck for him, if not anyone else. He called most of their former classmates by their names now, but still fell back on his tried and true nicknames for them. A deep wave of sadness swept over her again for a brief moment. It had been almost a year since he'd been called Kaken. She wondered if he missed it, but knew better than to ask. As far as he was concerned probably, the name had died along with Deku. After changing into shorts and a t-shirt, Uraraka fell back in bed and crashed quickly, as if she'd lost all strength to fight the battle against the alcohol. Hopefully the amount of food and water she'd consumed would prevent any sort of hangover, but only the morning would tell. Luckily, the alcohol had the effect of dampening any dream she might have had, so that by the time she woke up, there was nothing to remember except Bakugo's words and that last look she'd seen on his face. She considered it a blessing that there was only a faint thumping in her head that would go away in an hour or so. Uraraka took her time getting up. She stretched in bed and yawned before snuggling up with her covers a little more and simply listening to the birds chirping and the morning traffic spilling in from her open window. When she finally got out of bed, she noticed just how quiet her apartment was. The last time Bakugo had crashed on her couch, she'd thought his snores were going to wake the dead, not that he'd ever copped to snoring. Peeking outside of her bedroom, Uraraka found it empty, though he'd charmingly left the pillows and blankets bunched up on her couch. Such a gentleman. She shook her head and went to the bathroom to start her morning routine. She really needed to go to the gym today. Then she'd start her round of apologies for going off the grid yesterday and ignoring everyone else's pain. For just a little bit longer, she wanted to stand in this strange morning bliss. It was like a small weight was off her shoulders. Not all of it, but just enough where she could stand up straight again. After finishing in the bathroom, Uraraka padded into the kitchen to make breakfast, only to find a bowl already made next to a note in Bakugo's writing that said, "Eat this." So he could cook breakfast but not fold up blankets? That man was full of surprises. He probably got up at the crack of dawn regardless of how much he drank or fought the night before. No rest for the wicked or those wanting to be at the top. Smiling to herself, she took the food and went back into her bedroom to pack all her stuff for the gym. She hummed under her breath as she did so, feeling better with every bite and passing second. It was going to be a good day. She was going to do some wonderful things. She was going to live her life. That was what Deku would have wanted. Not just to push herself as a hero, but also as a person. He had been so thoughtful. Uraraka was still humming pleasantly when she walked back into the kitchen to clean out her dish when a voice abruptly shattered everything. "Good morning, Pachako." Instead of falling to the ground, the bowl floated up to the ceiling the second Uraraka let go of it to form fists and spun around. Her heart had leapt into her throat because for a half a second she'd opened her mouth to say a name that she'd spent months unable to speak, but no, it couldn't be. This was just a setback, like when she woke up sometimes and forgot he wasn't in bed next to her, or how she'd leave the shop down the street and think she saw a flash of his green hair moving around the corner. But then she turned around completely and her hands flew to her mouth and her heart dropped into her stomach. Uraraka barely managed to whimper, but the name tumbled out of her mouth. Deku? There he was, Deku, her Deku, like he'd never been gone. Sitting in the chair that they'd bought at a flea market and he'd refurbished for her just because he thought it would make her smile. It was undeniably him, alive and well and in her living room. His unmanageable green hair. His vibrant green eyes. The freckles that never left his face even as his body grew taller and stronger. Out of all things, he was wearing a black suit and matching vest, and his tie, her lips trembled at the sight, his red tie was still done far too short. She would have burst into tears had she not been so stunned. However, when Deku smiled at her, a cold chill ran down her spine, and the thought runaway came to her mind when she had only ever run to him before. And she knew. She knew there was something wrong with that smile, something not quite right, but then none of this was right. I missed you. Deku had died. She'd watched his body crash into the cold, dark waves right after he'd hit the air hard enough to send her back up and keep her from following him. She had spent nearly 11 long months mourning and missing him. She'd screamed and cried, begged and raged, hollowed herself out and built herself back up again. How was he here? Why was he here? She wanted to run to him, throw her arms around him, never let him go. She also wanted to get the hell out of here. Did you miss me? Deku asked, so calm and light. Uraraka tried desperately to find her voice, but it felt as if it had been taken from her. Of course I missed you. There's not a day that went by that I didn't think of you. Is that so? Deku's voice was little more than a murmur, beckoning her closer, but she didn't move. This wasn't real. She was dreaming. And if she wasn't dreaming, then this was some sort of trick. A villain with some sort of quirk to transform into someone else, like Toga from the League of Villains, but she'd been killed years ago. Uraraka knew that she should react by defending herself, but instead found herself replying, yes. You died and I couldn't just let go of you. I couldn't just move on dash. Oh, but you did, didn't you? Deku stood from his seat, as if unfurling himself. The power that radiated from him was enough to almost cause her knees to buckle, but she held her ground. What was happening? This wasn't him. This wasn't Deku. It couldn't be. He was dead. He was dead. He was here in her living room. It wasn't him, and yet she knew that it was. She knew it was him like she knew her own quirk. Because he had been a part of her. Uraraka couldn't breathe. Deku took 4 steps forward and then picked up the blanket on the couch, holding it between 2 fingers with a look of faint disdain on his face. It was such a strange look for him to wear. She'd never seen it before, and it didn't line up with everything she'd loved about him. Really, Ochako? Kaken? I've got to confess, I didn't see that one coming. It was the use of Bakuga's nickname that did her in. Kaken. It was like an electric shock went from her head all the way down to her toes. It was him. Tears sprung into her eyes. Deku. She started trembling, unable to stop herself, as she thought about the nights she had dreamed that she would wake up and he would in the living room or kitchen like nothing had ever happened. But now he was here and she was afraid. In a flash, Deku was in front of her. Had he used his quirk? A concerned expression on his face. She knew that face. She knew him. But even with his features smoothed into something that she recognized, he looked off. Maybe it was his eyes, those bright green eyes, like he was looking at her from not quite seeing her. It's okay, Ochako, it's okay, he told her gently, cupping her face in his hands. She could feel the scars on his hand that he'd broken repeatedly at UA to become a hero. He brushed the tears away with his thumbs, as he had done so many times before. I know. It's a lot to take in. She couldn't stop the tears if she tried, and her knees finally buckled, so she fell against him. He took her weight like it was nothing, leaning into her even further and pressing his forehead against hers. It even smelled like him. Leaning against him felt so familiar, like a part of her had come back home, that she wanted to bury herself in him and never come back up for air. And yet she kept thinking about the way he was holding her face. His fingers were soft as he touched her skin and swiped at her tears, but they trembled every so slightly, like he was holding himself back. From what? It occurred to her that he could kill her with just an ounce of his power. All he had to do was squeeze a tiny bit and she would be dead. More dead than him apparently. Why you were gone and I felt so lost without you, Uraraka cried. She had handled her world turning upside down once before, she didn't know if she could do it again. This wasn't home. I'm here now, Deku told her in a soft voice. I wanted to come back to you earlier. I really did. He sounded so earnest that it hurt her. But I couldn't. I had work to do, you see, and they wouldn't let me. Even though tears were still slipping down her cheeks and she was a sniveling mess, she lifted her head slightly so that she could look him in the eyes. They looked so wrong. They wouldn't let you? Deku sighed. It was such a mess when I was brought in and, of course, they didn't trust me at first. I wouldn't have trusted me. But I showed them in time and they let me come back. He either didn't notice the confused look on her face or he didn't care. He was starting to ramble, a habit that he had never outgrown. She had loved him, did love him? For it. I had to see you again. I had to. It was all I could think about sometimes. You in our bed by yourself at night, sitting at the counter alone, rewatching our favorite movies. The thought of you here alone killed me and I couldn't stand thinking that you had no one. It had wounded her too. All those things had stung to the point where she'd begun to feel numb. It didn't feel the same without him here. The bed was too large, their favorite movies no longer entertaining, having to play the radio or turn on the news just to hear a voice while she ate. This had been their first place together, chosen by the both of them, and the apartment that she'd once loved had turned into a prison at times. She was so caught up in agreeing with him that she didn't notice the sudden shift in Deku. His thumbs stopped brushing her cheeks, the smile faded from his face, and he tilted his head as he examined her. You can imagine my surprise when I was told that you'd been seen with Kaken multiple times. I couldn't believe it. Out of all our friends, him? Even after showing me pictures, I thought they had to be fake. And then I saw him leaving here this morning. I brought you flowers. I thought about making you breakfast and he'd already done it. I'd forgotten what a good cook he was. How thoughtful of him. He was just being friendly dash. Since when has Kaken ever been friendly? Deku laughed and it was so cold that she had to fight the urge to shiver. He slid a finger from her cheek down under her chin, his eyes falling from hers down to her lips. No, I know him. I know when he wants something and how he goes about taking it. His hand shifted as his thumb moved to caress her chapped lips. But you're mine. I won't have him stepping in my shoes, in my bed, my home. This is my life. He can try to beat me at everything, but he won't win this. Uraraka was at a loss for words. For as long as she could remember, Deku had never been the jealous type. Even before they had started dating, when she tried her best to get over her silly crush on him and see other people, he had never been angry about it. He'd confessed to being upset, but not at her. All he'd wanted for her was happiness, and if that meant being with someone else because he was too shy or too busy, then he could handle it. He had been such a good friend. The relief when they'd first gotten together had been overwhelming, like they had both been waiting for that page to turn on their lives. This felt so wrong. There was an undercurrent of rage under his words that her mouth dried up. It reminded her of Bakugo, although he never tried to hide it. He let everyone know what he was feeling, whereas Deku tried to hide it so as to not be a burden. Wasn't him hiding his anger though. He was letting it course through him, like his one-for-all quirk. It's not your fault, Deku told her, making her mind spin. Kaken can be charming when he wants to be, and you were in a vulnerable position. I should have come back to you sooner, but they wouldn't let me, so I tried to get your attention. A bright smile popped onto his face. I thought, what would make Ochako happy? Getting rid of villains. There were a handful that we needed out of our way so we could expand and, sure, it would have made more sense to recruit them, but they were nothing compared to me. It worked out so perfectly. I got rid of them and it made you happy too. That? Uraraka thought back. It was true that villains in her section had dropped significantly over the past few months and there hadn't been so much as a purse snatching in her neighborhood in so long. Maybe it wasn't the fact that villains were avoiding the area so much as they were being taken out of commission. Deku, what did you do? I killed them, Deku said cheerfully. For you? Well, and for the others, but they were just a means to get me back to you. Horror crept into Uraraka's bones, but when she tried to pull away, Deku's grip tightened on her without him even moving or changing his expression. It wasn't enough to hurt her, but she was afraid that if he went any further, he would leave bruises on her. She didn't understand. He kept saying they without explaining who they were, but she had a feeling that she already knew. And he'd killed villains? For her? For them? Where have you been? Uraraka asked, trying her hardest to sound strong despite the fact that the ground underneath her was shaking. Who are you talking about? Deku looked her over like he was checking for wounds, smoothing her hair down. The League of Villains, silly. Well, 2.0. We kind of crushed them before, didn't we? He laughed brightly, tilting his head. It's much better this time around, much stronger. They really know what they're doing. I finally feel like I belong. My power is mine. This time, when Uraraka jerked away from him, he let her and she staggered into the countertop behind her, the marble digging into her lower back. The expression on his face was far too blank for comfort. It was like he was painting all those other emotions on his face when he deemed necessary, and this was his true face. Nothing. Not a hint of who he was before. Who are you? Uraraka demanded. You know who I am? The Deku I know and love wouldn't do anything like this, Uraraka told him. Deku shrugged his shoulders. That Deku drowned. This is who I was truly meant to be. No, he was wrong. Uraraka shook her head violently, too shocked to cry anymore. Deku was meant to be a hero. He was meant to be a symbol of peace. He was going to become the greatest hero in the world. This Deku she couldn't understand or accept. When he reached out for her again, she slapped his hands away, but then he grabbed her by the wrists, this time hard enough to bruise, and jerked her against him even as she shouted at him to let her go. He was stronger than her, always had been, but he'd never once used that against her before unless they were competing at school. The feeling of wrongness crept over her like inky black water, making her feel as if she was the one drowning now. I don't expect you to understand right away, Deku told her, his tender tone contrasting sharply with the way he was gripping her in a vice. I'm not unreasonable. It took me time too. He smiled at her again, that smile that she had loved, the smile that made her tremble now. It wasn't him. Just know that I love you and I will never leave you again. I won't let you get hurt. She couldn't find it in her heart to tell him that he was hurting her now. She was lost in those eyes, threatened to be swallowed completely by how hollow they looked now that she was so close to his face. All she knew was that she had to say something or everything would go terribly wrong. She could feel herself standing on a precipice where if she took one wrong step she would be the one falling, and she was scared that he'd be the one to push her over. I love you too, Uraraka whispered, and she did. She had loved him and she did love him and she would always love him. But this wasn't him. His grip on her tightened for a second and then loosened, but instead of letting her go, Deku cupped her face again and pressed his lips against hers in a searing kiss. Even though she knew it was wrong and that everything was shattered into pieces, for a brief moment, she let herself revel in it. She let her hands rest lightly against his chest, the steady beat of his heart telling her that he was alive, and despite the tears on her face and lips, he clung to her like she was a breath of fresh air, and she missed him something terrible. When the moment was over and Deku pulled away from her, Uraraka could only stare at him in horror. He looked so unimaginably happy, just as he had been the day they'd first moved in here. Deku stroked her cheek, focusing on the pink spots, and then reached past her to grab something on the counter, the length of his firm body pressed up against hers as he ignored her personal space. I know the first person you're going to tell is Kakin, and while I'm disappointed, I understand you'll need someone aggressively strong, so let me help you get the point across. She heard the scratching marks of pen on paper and watched Deku's face out of the corner of her eyes as he left his mark. When he was done, he set the pen down and fully pulled away from her, leaving her swaying on the spot. Where? Uraraka had to speak. Her mind was screaming at her to pull herself together, but she could barely move, much less talk. Where are you going? Back to work, Deku answered. There's a lot to be done. She wanted to throw up. Back to work. Back to the new League of Villains. Her death. She clenched her fists at her side, but nothing happened. Part of her wanted to smack him and activate her quirk on him, but she had a feeling that whatever was holding him together would fall apart at the seams if she did. Then, despite his promise, he would hurt her. She didn't know. She couldn't risk it when she felt like everything she'd known was wrong. See you soon, Ochako, Deku promised before simply walking out the front door, like it was just another morning and he was off to the hero agency he worked at. Except he wasn't going to where heroes went. He was going back to villains and darkness and shadow. Uraraka stood in place for a terribly long time, trembling and holding her hands over her mouth so that she either wouldn't cry or scream. She wasn't sure which one would come out. Finally, she dragged her eyes to look back at the counter and saw what Deku had written on the note Bakugo had left her earlier. It seemed like a lifetime ago, another world away, like she'd woken up and fallen into an alternate universe. But seeing Bakugo's scratchy writing next to Deku's careful one confirmed that this was her reality now. Tears welled up in Uraraka's eyes again when she saw Deku's note, and a muffled whimper of notes tumbled out of her lips from behind her hands. Deku was alive. He was alive. Her dream had come true, and it turned out to be a nightmare. It took longer than Uraraka wanted to admit for her to pull herself up from the ground where she'd crumpled into a ball after Deku had walked out. She could still smell him, feel the warmth of his lips on hers and the tight grip on her wrists. When she finally stood up and looked down at them, she could see the bruises already forming on them, the marks that stood out noticeably as fingers. Once she started moving though, she couldn't stop and she almost forgot the note in her haste to rush out the door. The first person she called, just as Deku had predicted, was Bakugo, but not for the reasons that Deku had said. He thought that she needed someone to hold her up, but she'd been doing just fine on her own. However, after realizing that she'd never even asked him how he was alive, she had come to conclusion that Deku was also fixated on Bakugo. It wasn't just her. He had come out of hiding, or the villains he was working for, being controlled by. After being confronted with hers and Bakugo's strange friendship, which was something that clearly displeased him on a furious level that she didn't know what to do with. She'd never had to deal with a jealous Deku before, much less one that seemed close to spiraling into violence at the drop of a pin. All of which made Uraraka think that while Deku proclaimed to not wanting to hurt her, Bakugo was in danger. No that he'd ever think that of himself, but they knew the extent of Deku's power. It was not something Bakugo could shrug off. As soon as she got in her car, Uraraka called Bakugo's cell. As she waited for him to pick up, she caught a glimpse of herself in her rearview mirror and winced. She looked terrible, like she'd gone on a bender. A part of her felt like she had. She was still shaking, even if her mind had stopped screaming. Deku was alive. He was alive. And apparently he was killing villains in her area like some sort of twisted love letter to her and also to benefit his new companions. Bakugo finally answered, sounding grouchy as ever. Uraraka, why the fuck are you? Where are you? Uraraka demanded, blazing right over him in what was normally his way. Her explosive interruption took him off guard so much that he answered, at the agency, without hesitation. Go figure he would go out day drinking and then go right back to work the next day like it was nothing. Then he seemed to gather himself. Why do you sound like you're a second away from losing your shit? Because I am losing my shit. Uraraka's mind screamed. I can't explain it over the phone, Uraraka told him. This was something that had to be said in person. Her mind was going 1,000,000 miles per hour as she tried to match it with her car. She would say that she was driving like Bakugo, but Deku had always warned her about her bad speeding habit. I'm coming there. What? Uraraka hung on him. No sense in dragging it out over the phone. He'd get over it the second she told him what was going on. My God, who else did she have to call? Tsu for sure, and then Todoroki next. She needed Tsu's straightforward mind and support, and Todoroki deserved to know immediately as well. He'd seen Deku's fall into the ocean. He'd seen Deku die. He had to know that Deku was alive. He had to know that Deku was a villain. It took Uraraka 20 minutes too long to get to Bakugo's agency. She practically slammed into a parking spot and had barely pulled the key out of the ignition before she was bolting through the doors. The wait at the front desk to confirm her identity was unbearable, but at least Bakugo had had the foresight to warn them about her coming so they didn't have to call him. She'd been to the agency he worked at a few times, so she knew where she was going without thinking. When she saw him, Uraraka came to a skidding halt, her entrance loud and surprising enough to catch more than a few eyes, including Bakugo's. The second his red eyes latched onto hers, she stomped towards him, giving him little time to narrow his eyes and say, Yura, before she grabbed him by the wrist and dragged him to the nearest room, which turned out to be a large supply closet. What the fuck, Uraraka? Bakugo demanded, ripping his wrist out of her grip. He was only wearing half his hero costume, which probably meant that he wasn't actually scheduled to work but came in to do paperwork and provide backup if needed. Do you have any idea what this looks like? She didn't care, but all that running and panicking had caught up with her and she was trying to breathe. For fuck's sake, you're gonna give everyone the wrong. Deku is alive. Uraraka exploded and then gasped for air again. She hadn't been ready, but she had needed to get the words out as fast as possible. Bakugo blinked and then furrowed his brow into a deep scowl. Are you still drunk? What? Uraraka returned his scowl. No. Well, did you take something? I mean, if you're hallucinating, we should probably get you to a hospital. I can't believe that you'd be so... I didn't take anything, Bakugo. Uraraka exclaimed, absolutely furious by his assumption. Granted, it wasn't that unreasonable. She was the one spouting off that her dead boyfriend was alive. But said dead boyfriend had been in her living room a little over 30 minutes ago and she was starting to freak out. Deku is alive. He was in my goddamn living room. He'd kissed her. And she'd kissed him back. Gods, she had thought she knew how much she'd missed him until that moment when he was right there, holding her, pressing his lips against hers. It had been so long that maybe she had started to forget, which ashamed her. He clearly hadn't. The passion hadn't left him one bit. If anything, the months apart where he had been very clearly not dead had intensified things for him. Bakugo grabbed her by the arms, enough to snap her out of the daze she'd fallen into, but not hard enough to hurt her. Not hard enough to cause bruises like the ones on her wrists that she was hiding with a long-sleeve shirt. She didn't even want to know how he would react to that. She didn't know how he would react to this. His eyes bore into hers with an intensity that she hadn't seen in Deku's. It made her feel sick again, Bakugo this close to her, just as Deku had been. He felt warmer. Maybe it was his quirk. You didn't just dream it? Bakugo asked her, again in that uncharacteristically quiet voice from last night. You said that you sometimes thought you saw him? Uraraka shook her head. He was sitting in the chair, just waiting for me. I don't know how long he was even in my apartment. Oh great, the tears were staring to come back. Who could blame her though? It was one thing for Deku to come back from the dead, quite another for him to do that and also apparently be working for a new and improved League of Villains. It was him, Bakugo, but it wasn't. There's something wrong with him, something wrong with his head. She forced herself to be still. You have to believe me. You're not making any sense, Bakugo told her. We saw him die almost a year ago. He's back and there's something wrong with him. Uraraka exclaimed. Fine, if you don't believe me. She dug the note out of her pocket and held it out to him. Look at this. It was the piece of paper that he'd written on this morning next to the breakfast he'd made her. He took it from her and looked down at it. At the top of the paper was his handwriting, "Eat this." And below it, in Deku's careful penmanship, "Thanks for making ochako. Breakfast, kaken." There was a few seconds where Bakugo didn't react at all and she was afraid that he thought that she had faked the whole thing somehow, like she'd learned how to write like Deku and forged this note. But then he crumpled the note in his hand and she had to grab his fist to keep him from letting off an explosion and burning it. For some reason, she couldn't stand the idea of burning Deku's writing. Bakugo raised his free hand and covered his eyes, a pained scowl on his face. That fucking little shit? After a while, he pulled his hand away and looked down at her. She was still holding onto his fist, leaning in close to him so that she had to tilt her head up to look at him. He's been gone for months. Of course he's not himself. What the fuck? Where the fuck was he? What was he doing? Here was the kicker, the thing that Uraraka knew would amount to a kick and a punch to his gut. He kept rambling on about how they wouldn't let him see me. Bakugo gave her a look that said to continue and she swallowed despite her mouth being dry. The League of Villains, Bakugo. They brought it back and I don't know how, but they got a hold of him and he's a part of them. Are you fucking shitting me? Bakugo snapped. You remember how I was telling you that it's been strangely quiet in my sector for a while? Uraraka didn't even want to think about it. All the heroes thought that they'd just been doing a good job, that their hard work had paid off and was acting as a deterrent. Meanwhile, there had been even more violent crimes happening under their noses. Sharks eating sharks. Crimes being perpetrated to commit crimes. Her lips trembled. He told me that he was killing villains to make me happy, to get them out of the way for me and the League. Bakugo just stared at her like she had two heads and honestly she didn't blame him. She wasn't doing a good job at explaining things. A few minutes ago, Deku had been dead and gone, and they'd gone out to mourn him on his birthday last night. Now he was alive and apparently a bad guy? Uraraka would have had trouble wrapping her head around it if not for the fact that he'd broken into her place to talk to her. Was it breaking in if he'd lived there before? His name wasn't on the lease anymore. "Tell me everything," Bakugo said slowly, "from the beginning." So Uraraka did as carefully as she could. Every time she started to derail, Bakugo would stop her by either touching her hand or saying something. She told him how Deku had just said hello like it was nothing. She told him how upset Deku had been over Bakugo being a part of her life, though she didn't mention how jealous he'd seemed. Maybe she had been reading into it too much. She told him everything that he'd said about the League and how he'd killed villains for her, like some twisted vigilante. She told him how Deku had said that he was never going to leave her, and then Uraraka blushed. "And he kissed me?" "He what?" Bakugo clenched his fists. "It's like to him nothing has changed," Uraraka said, "like he was never gone." There was a beat where they just stared at each other and Bakugo said, "Like you're still his?" "What?" Bakugo leaned forward, putting a hand against the wall next to her head so that he towered over her, and she pressed herself back against the wall. Despite him crowding her, she didn't feel threatened, not like she had when Deku had cupped her cheeks and looked her over. "Are you?" Uraraka frowned and glared up at him. "My dead boyfriend came back to life, broke into my apartment, and told me that he's become a villain and killed people to get my attention. I don't know what the fuck I am." That seemed to appease him or snap him out of whatever fog he was in. Bakugo pulled away from her and ran his fingers through his sandy blonde hair. It was already a mess, like usual, but him tugging at it made it worse. He didn't seem to know what to do with his hands though, and he started to pace in the small space of the closet as his brain went into overdrive. "Shit, this is so fucked." Bakugo rubbed his face. "We've got to fuck." He fist slammed into the door, putting a slight dent into it. Uraraka didn't flinch. "I don't know what we're supposed to do. We can't just sit on this." He turned to face her. "Have you told anyone else?" "No," Uraraka said. "I came to you first." Bakugo nodded. "Okay, well, we need to— Shit, should we just call everyone from our class? What's the fucking protocol for shit like this?" She didn't know, hence why she had come here to him. "We need to call Todoroki first. I'm sure you'll tell Tsuyu and Ida, and I'll let Kirishima know." "Fuck, this is going to be bad." He groaned. Why couldn't Deku? That was a sentence he couldn't finish. "We'll get a hold of everyone, tell them we need to meet. I don't care if they're on their fucking deathbed, they better get healthy and show up. No excuses. This is some serious ass shit." As Bakugo talked, Uraraka could only nod her head in agreement. She had known that she would be the one to call Todoroki. It was expected of her to talk to Tsuyu, but Bakugo hadn't spoken to Todoroki since Deku's funeral as far as she knew. There wasn't any need for them to stay in contact without Deku in the middle. Uraraka had tried her best, but had come to the conclusion that without Deku, there was nothing to bridge the two. Deku had been like that for a lot of people. Their group had never been the same without him. He'd been the glue. "Uraraka, are you with me? Are you listening?" She closed her eyes. It was him. It was what I wanted, and no, she wouldn't cry again. She wouldn't. He was so off and I was scared. I've never been scared of him before, but I knew that if I made one mistake, that would be the end of it. She brought her hands up to cover her face. "He promised he wouldn't hurt me, but—" Without warning, Bakugo grabbed one of her hands and shoved back her sleeve. "What the fuck?" He did the same with her other wrist and then held them out so he could see the bruises as plain as day. Did he do this? She didn't want to admit it, but she bit her lip and he knew. "What do you call this then?" He gripped her hands tighter so she couldn't pull them away and hide the bruises again, but not tight enough where it hurt. "If this isn't hurting you—" He didn't mean it. Uraraka exclaimed, knowing damn well how foolish she sounded. "It's not him. He still did it." Bakugo countered furiously. Uraraka jerked her hands away from him and he let them slip out of his grip. Just as quickly though, despite glaring at him, she threw her arms around his middle and he pulled her into a hug. She wasn't going to cry, but she needed this. She was terrified. She didn't know what to think, She didn't know what to do. What was wrong with Deku? What had happened to him? She should have been able to save him. She should have been stronger. She should have been quicker. This is so fucked up, Bakugo sighed into her hair. A mirthless laugh tumbled from Uraraka's lips. He didn't even know the half of it, but she couldn't tell him that he had to be there in order to know the full extent. She had a terrible feeling that Bakugo would find out soon enough. She didn't think this Deku was the kind to let sleeping dogs lie. That was what scared her even more. After what was probably too long for hugging, but Uraraka had really needed it, Bakugo pulled away from her and said, "We're going to need more proof than this note." Uraraka pondered it for a moment and then a light bulb went off in her head. He left out the front door. "I've got a security camera out there that takes pictures of everyone that gets in its view. You installed it like I suggested," Bakugo said, as if he hadn't actually believed she would. She hadn't at first when he'd told her 6 months ago. She had thought it was stupid and pointless. But after Deku's death, all of her friends had wanted to take more precautions on protecting herself, as if Deku alone had been the deterrent for anyone to come after Uravity. She'd won it a few months ago on a whim, but so far it had only caught awkward pictures of her friends and an embarrassing amount of food delivery people. Uraraka stared up at him. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Shit. Bakugo pressed the heel of his palm against one of his eyes. "We need to take some time off. This shit is big. But we can't tell anyone outside our group yet. I don't know. Just send some messages out. I've got to talk to my boss." He opened the supply closet door, ignoring the looks of everyone in the office, and dragged her out. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked her in the eyes. "Stay here. Don't do something stupid." To be honest, she couldn't move if she tried. An overwhelming sense of nothingness threatened to wash her away in the wake of her telling Bakugo what had happened. Outside of telling their friends, she didn't know what to do. She had a feeling that Deku would find her first, and that both terrified and exhilarated her. Now that he wasn't in front of her, she was desperate to pull him back and try to make him see reason, but a small part of her knew that the second she saw him, she would do no such thing. She was too scared of breaking whatever piece of him remained sane. "I should have searched for you longer," Uraraka thought desperately, even though she knew it was futile. Tsu had been the one to pull her away when his body had never been found despite their best efforts. They hadn't even had a body for his funeral, which made perfect sense now since he hadn't been dead. A loud noise from the head honcho's office startled Uraraka out of her thoughts. She heard Bakugo shout, "That's not the case at all," and then some more muffled, angry noises. Every other hero and sidekick kept shooting glances at her and then the closed door until Bakugo practically kicked the door open and stormed out, forcing them to pretend as if they were busy working. Bakugo wasted no time in leaving, grabbing her gently by the wrist despite the tension in his body, and dragging her into the elevator as he growled, "Let's go, round face." There was no time for Uraraka to respond, only follow him, as she staggered into the elevator and then watched the doors shut. As soon as they were alone, he let go of her and turned to face. "Did I hurt you?" "Huh. Oh," the bruises on her wrist. Uraraka shook her head. "No, it's fine. I bought us some time." Bakugo looked away. "Did you call your agency?" Of course he was on top of things. Uraraka was having trouble figuring out what was up and what was down. As they walked out of the building, she called her agency and made up an excuse that her grandma was dying and she needed some time out of the office. The fact that her grandparents had already passed was not something that they knew, so they told her to take the time that she needed. Bakugo seemed pleased with the outcome, but there was still a grim expression on his face. The next step was sending a group message. The two of them stood in the parking lot, debating each other about what to say, until they finally settled on something. Uraraka noted that she had more people while Bakugo stuck with the main people in his crew at school. "Meet at Bakugo's tonight at 8. Extremely important. Dire situation." Bakugo had wanted to add that they would be fucked up if they didn't show, but Uraraka had disagreed. Already the text was too short to give an idea of what was going on, but their class was smart. They'd had texts like this sent out to them before, like Deku's location ping concerning the hero killer back in their first year at UA, so everyone knew that when a mass group text was sent out like this, it was serious, especially if Bakugo was part of it. He hadn't been happy about using his place as a meeting place, But considering hers had been broken into, it was the best option. As expected, on the way back to her apartment, Sue called. "Ochako, what was that text about?" "I can't explain it over the phone," Uraraka told her, rattling with nerves. She could see Bakugu's car behind her. No way was he letting her go back to her place alone to check the surveillance camera. She didn't think Deku would be there. He'd told her that he was busy and needed to go to work, but the idea of her going alone had nearly sent Bakugu off the deep end. "I just need you to be there." "Does it have something to do with you and Bakugu?" Sue asked almost cautiously. "What? No." "Well, it kind of did." Uraraka had gotten the impression that Deku wanted to make sure that Bakugu was out of the picture. How? She wasn't for sure. "Sue, I can't talk about this right now." She closed her eyes. She was weak. She wanted to tell her best friend. It's more complicated than that." "It's okay. I understand, Ribbit." Sue had a way of getting to the point of things that Uraraka struggled with, this being one. She accepted what Uraraka said and would wait. "I'll see you tonight." Uraraka desperately wished everyone else could be that easy. Because they had sent a group text and both of them had been stupid enough to put each other in their texts in case one couldn't respond, her phone was blowing up. People were demanding answers, sending shitposts that she knew would piss Bakugu off, freaking out, and making wild assumptions that somehow seemed more logical than the truth. The only time that Uraraka paid attention to it was when Bakugu sent out a text, "Uraraka is not pregnant." It had her raising her eyebrows, but no one texted after that, so it at least had the desired response. Gods, she hoped Deku couldn't get a hold of these messages. Judging from the way he'd reacted to Bakugu sleeping on her couch, the idea that she might be pregnant with his child would send Deku on a rampage. Uraraka clenched her steering wheel tightly. She didn't know what would send Deku off the rail, but she had a bad feeling that if it had to do with Bakugu or her, it wouldn't be good. She thought to call Bakugu to tell him to hang back just in case they were being watched, but she knew that he wouldn't agree no matter what. She had a feeling that her alone time was going to be at an all-time low. It would limit the chances of a hero-turned-villain popping up on her unannounced. She parked reasonably slower at her apartment than she had at Bakugu's agency. He was not so slow. However, she noticed that when he got out, his eyes surveyed the area and he had his hands palm out like he was ready for a fight. Like he was waiting for Deku to pop up and to explode him. He was being cautious, she knew, but it made her feel only tired. Deku wasn't around. He was off doing villain work. Uraraka wouldn't have been able to say how she knew except that she did. He was a part of her, even now that she didn't wholly recognize him. She knew. The walk up to her apartment to check on the computer that dealt with the surveillance was eerily silent. Bakugu spent the whole time looking out of the corner of her eyes while he made sure Uraraka was only one step ahead of him in case he had to grab her or something. She could tell that he was defending her and it irritated the hell out of her, but she said nothing. It was a stark difference from last night when he had carried her up the stairs, his body tense but his touch soft. It was hard to believe that had been less than a day ago. When she went to open the door, Bakugu swung an arm around her to pull her back and said, "Hold on. Let me check it first." But Uraraka was too tired and worn thin to deal with that, so she shoved him off of her and exclaimed, "Would you stop it?" and then barreled into her apartment with him sputtering angrily behind her. Of course there was no one in here. Deku was gone. There wasn't a single trace that he had been in here. She'd remembered to release the floating bowl right before she left, letting it fall into the sink. Sitting down at her desk, she opened up her laptop and pulled up the surveillance program. Her heart leapt into her throat the second she found Deku's picture. Judging by the way he was looking directly in the camera, a big grin on his face and his hand held up in a friendly wave, he'd known about it and had gone out the front intentionally. It was almost a sweet picture, except for the fact that everything about it felt wrong. There was an off tilt about the way he held himself, leaning slightly to the left as if off balance. She almost reached out to touch the screen, but then pulled her hand back. Behind her, Bakugu stared hard at the screen. One of his hands was gripping the back of her chair so tight that his knuckles were white and he was leaning over her, his chest brushing against her back. She felt when he growled low under his breath upon seeing the picture, but when she glanced back and up at him, there was an unreadable expression on his face. She couldn't tell what he was thinking and it made her shrink in her seat. "He's still a damn nerd, even now," Bakugo grouched, reaching over her to print the picture. Uraraka flashed back to when Deku had done the same thing to write the note, like both had forgotten her personal space. It felt different though, her skin wasn't crawling. "It's like he's toying with us." Even though the image felt wrong, Uraraka thought she could see hints of her Deku in him, like the real him was peeking out below the surface. It gave her hope that she could save him, or maybe she was just kidding herself. She couldn't stand the idea of giving up on him though. She felt as if she'd done it once already, accepting his death when she should have kept on looking for him. He'd been out there, who knows what being done to him in order to twist his mind, and she just lived her life. She'd done nothing to save him. She wouldn't do it again. Uraraka swore that she'd go to the ends of the earth if it meant saving Deku. She didn't care what anyone else thought. By the time 8 rolled around, Bakugo's apartment was cramped and Uraraka was a bundle of nerves. It had taken everything in her not to explode multiple times throughout the day. While everyone else was in the living room or connected dining area, she hung out in his bedroom, sitting on the edge of his bed and bouncing her foot. She knew that she was hiding right now, but she couldn't help it. She felt guilty for wishing that she could rewind to this morning so that none of this had happened, but a small part of her was still happy that he was alive. She'd lost count of how many times Bakugo had checked the perimeter to make sure that Deku wasn't around. Maybe he'd wanted Deku to show his face. Bakugo had never felt more like a ticking time bomb before. The once strange but easy flow between them was staticky and tense. He hadn't been in a talkative mood and she hadn't forced him, too lost in her own mind. She knew that it would be only a matter of time before he blew up, she just didn't know when or how bad it would be. The door swung open and Bakugo stepped inside, shutting it behind him. "Now you're just trying to make things look bad." Uraraka gave him a frazzled look and he let out a huff before walking towards her. When he was standing right in front of her, he folded his arms across his chest and looked down at her. "Everyone's here." Well, everyone important at least? The fact that he'd admitted that other people were important definitely showed how serious this was. "What am I supposed to say?" Uraraka asked him. "The truth, duh," Bakugo told her. "Deku's alive masquerading as a villain and is obsessed with you." Uraraka frowned at his description. She couldn't understand how he could sound so flippant about this while she felt like she was dying on the inside, but then she noticed how tense he was holding his arms and how he was straining to keep his expression passive. She wanted to tell him that he could talk to her, tell her how this was affecting him and not just her, but she had a feeling that he'd brush her off right now. Instead, she took a deep breath, stood up, and walked out of the bedroom. Immediately, she was assaulted by the distressed voices of her former classmates and friends. Kirishima and Ito were the loudest, the latter rushing up to ask her if she was okay. Then it was Ashido, pushing him aside so that she could hug Uraraka even though she hadn't said anything. Kaminari was in his hero costume, having come straight from work, while Momo was wearing a very nice gown, looking like she'd led an opera to come here. Everyone was shouting over each other with the exception of Todoroki, who was leaning against the threshold of the kitchen and eyeing her carefully. "Everyone shut the fuck up," Bakugo yelled, the loudest of them all as usual. It got their attention at least. "I've got one rule and one rule only, no interrupting until she's done saying what she's gotta say, no matter how much you feel like we need your opinion." Uraraka stood in front of her friends and wrung her hands together as they looked at her with a mixture of confusion and wariness. How insane this must be to all of them, having received a terse and demanding message from both her and Bakugo. She wondered what they were thinking. She'd ignored the flood of text messages while Bakugo had sent a flurry of them back with barely contained fury. She didn't realize that she was trembling again until Tsu grabbed her hand and she stilled herself. "I know this is going to sound like I've gone mad, but..." Uraraka closed her eyes. She pictured Deku standing in front of her, wearing that smile, the one that had sent chills down her spine. It pained her to think of him like that, like her memory of him had been tainted. She wanted the old one back. She didn't want to remember him like this. It wasn't him. She looked at all of her friends. They'd mourned him too. Deku is alive. As predicted, the room exploded, everyone so loud that she couldn't understand anything. Shock, confusion, and disbelief spread like wildfire through the room until Bakugo yelled, "What did I say?" It took an incredible amount of willpower for everyone to quiet themselves, but he glared at them so viciously that they finally did. Most of them outright gawked at her. Even Tsu had pulled her hand away, too stunned to say anything. When she caught Todoroki's eyes, he nodded his head for her to continue, but she saw the way his fingers twitched. Everything spilled out of her in a flood of words. She felt as if she'd talked for hours, rehashing the story one more time, draining her completely. It was like she'd been holding herself up for days, and now all she wanted to do was collapse in bed and hide under her covers. As she spoke, horror slowly crept onto everyone's faces. Momo with her hands to her mouth, Jiraiya painfully still, Ashido with tears in her eyes. Kirishima held his head in his hands, staring into the distance, while Kaminari's mouth was wide open and Siro was silently wording swears. Ojiro covered his eyes with his tail and looked away. Tsu placed a hand back on Uraraka's back. Tokoyami grew more tense every second that passed. And then there was Todoroki, whose expression had hardened and a shadow hung over his face. When she finished, a heavy silence had fallen over the room. It didn't look like anyone could speak even if they tried. The shock was too raw. Bringing Deku back into their lives like this felt like him dying all over again. It reopened up their wounds. His death hadn't just affected her. It had hit all of them hard, and they'd spent months grieving and then getting back in the game. Now it was like they had to mourn him in a different way. Kirishima was finally the one who broke the silence. What the hell? His hands fell from his face, like he didn't have the strength to hold them up anymore. How? We searched for him for weeks. Uraraka bit her lip. I don't know. I guess they found him first. It doesn't matter, Bakugo interjected with a tone that didn't allow room for arguments. What matters is how we react. A few people nodded their heads, but most were still too stunned to do anything. Our number one priority should be Uraraka's safety. Uraraka whipped around on him. Excuse me? I can take care of myself. I'm not questioning that. But we're dealing with someone that is off his rocker and capable of destroying a building with a single punch, Bakugo countered heatedly, staring at her hard to get her to back down. Uraraka would do no such thing. I'm not going to hide while he's out there, Uraraka said. Besides, Deku said that he wouldn't hurt me. Bakugo's eyes flickered to her wrists, the bruises hidden from sight once again, but she was relieved that he didn't bring them up out loud. She would tell Tsu, Ida, and Todoroki later, but not out here. There were some things that she wanted to keep private, and for some reason she couldn't bear everyone knowing that he had harmed her, even if she wasn't for sure if it had been intentional. Now that she looked back on the moment, it had almost seemed like he hadn't known that he was gripping her too hard. The entire time, it had felt like he was holding himself back, like he wasn't used to it but was doing it for her. I'm not going to take that chance, Bakugo told her flatly. I agree with Bakugo, Tsu put in. Uraraka gazed down at her best friend with an incredulous look, feeling almost betrayed. Not her too. You are a very capable hero and strong in your own right, but Midoriya is on another level. We all know that. And if he really is working for the League and killing people, then I doubt that he'll have an aversion to hurting you if he deems it necessary, Ida added uneasily. From what you described, he sounds like he's barely holding it together. Uraraka didn't want to admit that they were right, but it was the truth. Deku had always told her how amazing of a hero she was and how strong she was too, but on a purely combat level, he was much more powerful than her. Even with no energy left in him, he had managed a punch that blew her away from the water and sent her flying in the air without her zero-gravity quirk on her. Besides, what if he did snap? It felt like they were playing a tense game of chess where they had to find a way to both placate Deku and stop him at the same time. First things first, we need to get you into a safe house, Bakugo decided. I am not hiding, Uraraka said flatly. I'm not leaving my apartment. It had been hers and Deku's home. While it had grown cold in his absence, now that he was back, even like this, she couldn't leave it empty. It was like a beacon at the top of a lighthouse, hopefully guiding Deku back to safety and home. Back to her. You can't stay there, Bakugo argued. It's totally compromised. He probably came in through your window that you always leave open and watched you sleep. The mental image was enough to make Uraraka shudder. How long had he been in her apartment before coming out into the open to surprise her? She dimly recalled Bakugo shutting the window last night, but it had been open this morning. It angered her to know that he was probably right, but this was one thing that she wasn't going to let go of. "I'm not leaving." Before Bakugo could yell anything back, Todoroki's cool voice sliced through the air. She should stay. It was the first time he'd spoken since arriving, and everyone turned to look at him. "Are you shitting me, icy hot?" Bakugo growled. "Midoriya is acting very possessive of Uraraka," Todoroki continued as if Bakugo wasn't glaring daggers at him. "If he gets the feeling that we're trying to keep her from him, I think he'll react very poorly and lash out. If he's killing villains just because he thinks it'll make her happy, who knows what he'll do if he's angry?" It was a valid question, one that Uraraka did not want to think about. Deku thought that what he was doing was right. Yes, it was for the League, but he was also doing good by getting rid of other villains. He could still be a hero in Uraraka's eyes. But what if he dropped that? What if that smile turned into a frown? What would he do if he was upset or mad? Todoroki focused his steady gaze on Bakugo, ignoring everyone staring at him. "It will be even worse if he believes you're the one trying to keep him away from her." There was a small smattering of explosions around Bakugo's hands. He was itching to fight someone, and Todoroki was pushing all the wrong buttons. If he wasn't careful, he'd take Deku's place right now. "What the hell are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Todoroki replied, infuriatingly cool. "He clearly has a grudge against you and thinks you're trying to take Uraraka away from him." "Yeah, I am," Bakugo shouted. "I don't want him in a 10-mile radius of her." "That's not what I mean, and you know it," Todoroki said. When Bakugo didn't respond, Uraraka glanced back him. There was an angry look on his face, but his entire body screamed that he was more uncomfortable than mad, like he knew that Todoroki was right but would be damned before admitting it. Kaminari looked at the two other guys. Are you saying that?" "Midoriya is jealous of Bakugo," Todoroki finished with a shrug of his shoulders. Bakugo was the only other person Midoriya mentioned, and it was only in reference to her. He thinks Bakugo is trying to take his place in her life as a romantic partner. The situation did not call for blushing, and yet both Uraraka and Bakugo did. Her face burned like it had caught on fire. Bakugo was seconds away from blowing a gasket. Why did Todoroki have to say it like that? Which, I believe, puts Bakugo in more danger than Uraraka. If we're going to guard Uraraka, you'll need to be as well. Now that the tables had been turned on him, Bakugo wasn't having it. Everything was fine with him when he thought that Uraraka needed protecting, but now that everyone was looking at him like he was the one with the bigger target on his back, he looked absolutely enraged. "Don't you fucking dare. I don't need protecting from him. If he wants to come at me, then let him. I'll pummel that villain shit right out of his head." "I think we should avoid a head-on fight with him as much as possible," Momo said. "The amount of destruction that he's capable of would be devastating." "There's no avoiding that," Bakugo snapped. "Like it or not, there will be a confrontation, and I aim to blast the shit out of him for pulling this shit." Again, Uraraka knew he was right, but she really wished he wasn't. Everyone knew it as well, glancing each other with unease and almost fear. None of them wanted to fight someone that they cared about, perhaps with the exception of Bakugo. She couldn't picture a scenario where they wouldn't have to confront Deku in combat at some point though, and she had a terrible feeling that he was going to be the one to make the first move. Much like Bakugo, Deku had seemed ready for a fight. He wanted to come out of hiding and show not just her but the world who he was now. It broke her heart. Kirishima sunk into the couch. "This is so messed up." Everyone fell silent again as they continued to absorb how much their lives had changed in a matter of minutes. It had felt like this back then too. She'd yelled at Bakugo to throw her towards Deku so she could touch him with her quirk, and he'd done it, but then she'd only managed to snag air. She'd released her quirk on herself so that she could fall with Deku, reaching out for him but always coming up short. The moment he'd knocked her back into the sky and he'd crashed into the ocean and went under, she had screamed. And nothing was ever the same again. A few minutes before he'd been standing at her side, and then he was just gone and her whole world had shifted into something she couldn't recognize. When Uraraka glanced back at Bakugo, she found him looking at her, a burning intensity in his red eyes that told her that he was going to protect her whether she wanted him to or not. Well, as long as he was good with her doing the same thing for him. She was going to save him and Deku. She would. She had to. If only she'd known just how bad things were, she might have let them hide her. Bakugo was fucking lit. He couldn't remember being so angry in his life, and he really had calmed down since graduating from UA, even if few believed it. He'd been so pissed that he'd just stood there as everyone else talked about who was going to guard who and how they were going to go about doing it. A steady rotation of guards between the two of them with one main person in charge of each. All he could do was stare down Uraraka, like she had been the one to say that he needed protection. He didn't. He could protect himself. He wouldn't lose to Deku no matter what, especially not with what was at stake. They hoped that someone always standing guard would keep Deku away, but Bakugo didn't want that. He wanted Deku to come find him. He wanted Deku to confront him. That way he could ground Deku's face into the concrete. For how he'd hurt Uraraka. He'd gripped her so tight that he'd bruised her wrists. Bakugo couldn't get the image of those bruises out of his head. It was beginning to drive him mad. Even worse was how Uraraka was brushing it off. He knew she was devastated and terrified. How she had held it together for everyone was nothing short of a miracle. There had been some crying here and there, but that was to be expected. He couldn't fault her for that. She was strong though and had no intentions of letting everyone else do the heavy lifting. He just wished that she'd see reason. They needed to get her out of Deku's reach. Kirishima slapped him on the back. "Looks like you're stuck with me and Ida for a bit." Bakugo groaned. Fucking great. He had to figure out a way to ditch them somehow. He had a feeling that as soon as he did, Deku would show his stupid nerd face. The anticipation of seeing him again was almost too much for Bakugo to take. He didn't really know how he felt about it, except that it needed to happen soon. "Who's staying with Uraraka?" "Todoroki and Tsu," Kirishima told him. Good. As much as Bakugo thought Todoroki could be a pompous ass, he could admit that Todoroki was also incredibly strong. Besides himself, he would consider Todoroki to be the best person to watch over Uraraka and keep her safe, and he knew that the other guy would do everything in his power to do so. She also undoubtedly needed the comfort that her best friend could give her. A small voice in the back of his mind yelled at him to do more for her, but he held himself back. Almost everyone had left, all of them in a daze. Kirishima was saying something, but Bakugo watched Uraraka talking with Jairu and Yayazora in hushed tones from the corner of his eyes. The three girls hugged and then parted, leaving Uraraka standing alone for the first time since she'd told everyone what was going on. Yeah, he said to Kirishima, not sure if it was even the right response, before walking over to her. Uraraka immediately turned to look up at him, as if she'd known that he would be there. She gave him a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Bakugo, for everything." "I'm not done yet," he told her gruffly. "We're gonna get him." Bakugo was going to save the goddamn nerd. He didn't know if he wanted to, and he didn't know what would happen if he did, but he knew that it had to be done. Deku as a villain was far too dangerous for the world. He had to be stopped. More importantly, it was wrong. Although he'd believed her after she had told him everything, it had been hard to picture Deku as a villain, much less a killer. When Bakugo had seen the picture of Deku on her doorstep though, his heart had damn near stopped. It was that same annoying smile that had made him want to punch something when they were younger, but then it wasn't, and he could see exactly what Uraraka had meant. It was Deku, but it wasn't. He couldn't put a finger on it, just that Deku looked off. The big smile hadn't reached his green eyes like normal. Deku's eyes. Bakugo thought back to the picture. He'd never seen eyes so dead before. He had a feeling that when they did light up, it was nothing good. For a moment, Bakugo half raised his hand so that he could touch her cheek, but then thought better of it and put it in his pocket instead. She didn't seem to notice. "Be careful, got it? If you so much as see a glimpse of him, you better call me." She nodded. "We're going to fix this. We'll get him back." Honestly, Bakugo didn't know what it would mean for him to get Deku back. They hadn't exactly been friends before he died, but they hadn't been enemies. Allies was probably the best way to describe them. They hadn't had quite the bitter rivalry that All Might and Endeavor had had, but it hadn't really been a friendly one either. They could work with each other and acknowledge their talent, But the competition had never died. Well, until Deku did. But what Bakugo couldn't think about, couldn't even let his mind go there, was what Deku's return would mean for him and Uraraka. He thought of her telling him last night that she would always love Deku. At the time it had been a sickeningly sweet sentiment, just like her. Now it just made him feel sick. He refused to think about it. Uraraka was gone too soon, swept out of his apartment by Tsuyu. For a moment, Todoroki hung back. He sighed and turned to face Bakugo, that impossibly impassive expression that had driven him crazy since high school resting on his face. I'm going to tell you this as nicely as possible, but I need you to stay away from Uraraka. Fucking what? Bakugo snarled. Are you her dad? It's for her safety as much it is for yours, Todoroki said, totally unfazed. Using Uraraka's safety against him was a low blow, but it was more effective than Bakugo's scowl apparently. The more you come around, the more Midoriya is likely to see you as a threat that needs to be eliminated. He might already be in that mindset, but maybe some distance will get him to lessen his fixation on you. I am a threat, Bakugo pointed out, though he didn't mean it in the way that Todoroki was suggesting. Telling everyone that Bakugo was interested in Uraraka romantically, that half-and-half bastard. It was none of their business. Besides, Bakugo didn't think she was ready. Of course. Todoroki thought he knew how strong Bakugo was. He didn't know the half of it. Neither did Deku. They'd find out soon enough. My main concern is Uraraka's safety. I'm worried his promise to not hurt her might get broken if he starts to believe that she's leaving him. If he feels betrayed by her, things could go downhill very quickly. I'd rather not risk it. Bakugo gritted his teeth because of course Todoroki was making perfect sense. Right now, Deku was living this nice fantasy where he came back and was going to play house with Uraraka again. That she might not choose him or agree with his new villain identity hadn't occurred to him. And when it did, Bakugo didn't doubt for a second that this new Deku would not let it or her go. There were those bruises on her wrists, like they were his mark on her saying, "You're mine." Taking a breath and forcing the rage to bleed out of him, Bakugo made a grunt in acknowledgement and turned away. He'd stay away from Uraraka unless she called for him. If Deku tried anything shifty with her, there wasn't anything the others could do to stop Bakugo from showing up and kicking his ass. Keep her safe, Bakugo said, implying that he was actually trusting Todoroki with her. If Deku comes around, I won't let him even come close, Todoroki promised, a hard edge in his voice finally breaking through the cold. And Tsuyu will make certain that Uraraka doesn't do anything foolish. She wants to believe the old Deku can come back. Bakugo gave him a sideways glance. Don't you? I'll let you know after I face him. Todoroki looked down at his left hand. It's going to happen sooner than later. That was something Bakugo could understand and agree with. He could feel it too. The air was charged with a power that reminded him of Deku's quirk. He also knew things would change once he saw Deku in person. He needed to see just how far Deku was gone. No offense to Uraraka, but she was seeing him through some rose-colored glasses and they all knew it. Even Bakugo didn't want to believe that Deku was at the point of no return, but he had to be so far out to even get to where he was now. After Todoroki left, the only other people with him were Kirishima and Ida. They all sort of stared at each other awkwardly, not knowing what to do or say, until Kirishima said, "So, movie? I'm going to bed," Bakugo said instead, blowing past the two to go into his room. "You all can do whatever the hell you want." He didn't wait for either of them to respond, slamming the door behind himself. Their muffled voices could be heard, but he ignored them. They weren't going to watch a movie. Deku floating around somewhere as a villain was too big of a thing to simply not talk about. He didn't think anyone was going to get a good night's rest tonight, least of all him or Uraraka. The whole situation sat heavy in Bakugo's mind. He threw himself on his bed and stared up at the ceiling, trying to imagine what it must have been like for Uraraka. What had Deku been like? She'd done her best to explain it, to him and to everyone else, but it was hard to say. He'd sounded excited, cheerful, very intense, maybe even slightly manic. He went from disdainful to understanding in seconds flat. Oh, Deku was good at being caring. He was so damn compassionate. Or was he any more? Was any of it real? Bakugo didn't know. It was still hard for him to picture Deku acting as he looked in the security camera photo. He still couldn't tie a damn tie properly to save his life. That had stuck out to Bakugo in a painful way, like it was some shitty reminder that it really was Deku in there somewhere. A truly far-gone villain Deku would know how to tie a tie, right? He had to have been lying in bed for hours obsessing over it when he heard his phone vibrate briefly on the table, alerting him to a text message. He didn't bother getting it at first, but then he had nothing else to do, so he rolled over and grabbed it to see who it was. Uraraka. I can't sleep. I keep thinking he's gonna crawl in my window and watch me. I feel so stupid. Bakugo's fingers curled around his phone. He shouldn't have said that and put the image in her head, but it was true. He'd thought that he had locked her window up, but Deku being Deku had probably made sure that there was a way for him to still get in through it. Bakugo had a feeling that it hadn't been the first time Deku had snuck around her apartment. It made his stomach flip and his hands sweatier than normal. Tatsugi. Is Tsuyu in there with you? Uraraka. No, I don't want to bother her. I already feel like burden having people guard over me like I'm some helpless civilian. Tatsugi. Stupid. They're there because they care about you and want to help. Let them. He wanted her to say that she wanted him there, not Todoroki or Tsuyu. He would be better at protecting her. He knew Deku better than anyone besides her, even more than Todoroki or Ida. Bakugo could admit that Todoroki was strong enough to take care of her, but it wasn't enough. He should be there with her. But he also knew that Todoroki was right. His presence around her would make things worse. His not being there makes him feel like shit though too. Uraraka. Be nice to Kirishima and Ida. They're worried about you too. Tatsugi. There's nothing to worry about. Go to sleep. Fucking understatement of the year. There was everything to worry about. Freaking Deku had come back from the grave to announce to the world that he was now a supervillain and gods knew what else. What was his endgame? What was his plan? Surely Uraraka wasn't the only thing motivating him. He'd told her that he had killed those villains to make her happy, but also because the League of Villains wanted them out of the way. Were they expanding their territory? Were they planning an attack on somewhere in the area? There was so much to consider that the idea of sleep was entirely lost on him. However, sleep had other ideas for him. Bakugo was mid-thought when he drifted off, his cell still in his hand. The first day on lockdown was painful, the second day almost unbearable. It was akin to house arrest and Bakugo was going mad. The three heroes circulated the apartment like it was a prison, trying to appear casual and like things were normal except they fucking weren't. Ida performed routine, quick perimeter checks, but nothing happened. No matter what they did, all conversations led back to Deku anyway. What they thought he was doing, what his game plan might be, how he'd survived, what happened to make him turn his back on everything he believed in. They needed to warn the authorities and especially All Might, but none of them had the heart or strength to do it. Bakugo didn't want to see the look on his hero's face when he found out his protege was using the gift he'd given him to do evil. Uraraka would most likely be the one to break the news. She was better at stuff like that. It shouldn't have to be her, but she'd shoulder the burden. Truth be told, they needed all the help they could get to deal with the shitstorm that was Deku. Aizawa's assistance was definitely needed. If they could cancel Deku's quirk for only a few seconds, they would have a much better chance at stopping him. But how? What if they got a hold of him and couldn't snap him out of his villain mindset? What if this was who he was now? A video call on Bakugo's laptop jerked them out of an intense argument about dinner. Noticing Kaminari's caller ID, they crowded around the computer as Bakugo sat down and answered the call. Checking in to make sure I haven't killed these two sorry asses yet? Yeah, sorry to disturb the fun, but, Kaminari squirmed in his seat, struggling to maintain eye contact with them. Have you seen the news? They shook their heads. The TV had gone untouched the entire day. Most of the information hasn't been released to the public yet, but I was able to find more details and video. He cringed. This isn't good. He sent them a link, which Bakugo clicked on. A vicious swear slipped out of him when the pictures loaded. The first one showed a giant hole in the side of a maximum security prison where many violent villains were held. Had been held. Judging by the smoke pouring from the prison and number of heroes and cops surrounding it, there probably weren't that many left. How many escaped? Ida questioned. 42, Kaminari answered. The exact number hasn't been officially released, but I have my ways. Fucking hell, Bakugo swore. 42 highly dangerous villains on the street all at once? Shit was going to hit the fan. More than anything, he needed to be out there, to do something, but he was locked up in his apartment. The agency would probably call him to come back in. Heroes were going to work overtime for months. Kirishima gripped Bakugo's chair tightly. Do you think it has something to do with Deku? He clearly hadn't wanted to, but it had to be asked. They looked at each other, waiting for someone to say it. It's him, Bakugo said decisively. We can't know for certain, Ida jumped in. Bakugo shook his head. It's him. Look at the size of that hole. Look at the damage. This was a calculated attack. We all know how meticulous he is. And for the League of Villains, this is the cream of the crop. Some of the old crew was locked up in there, including 1 or 2 that had a hand in Bakugo's kidnapping when he was a student at UA. The fact that Deku broke them out stung on a personal level. There were other prisons they could have attacked, but they chose this one. Deku was waving at him shouting, "Look what I did, Kaken." Like that stupid note he wrote below Bakugo's. He'd put some of those criminals in there and Deku had busted them right back out. Do the others know? Ida asked. I don't think so, or I would have heard something. Kaminari fiddled with the headset of his hero costume. He'd gone to work like everything was normal, but he was definitely not feeling it. I wasn't sure if I should tell Uraraka or not. It'll really upset her. Not telling her will piss her off, Bakugo pointed out, which I can assure you is infinitely worse. An ill sort of look fell over Kaminari's face, but he sighed in understanding. Besides, she'll find out anyway. It should be from one of us. You're right, Kaminari sighed. I'll send you the details I have now and any further updates. And keep searching for any leads on Deku's whereabouts, Bakugo reminded him sharply. Kaminari bounced his head in a tired but dutiful nod. I don't care if it's just a grainy picture of the back of his dumb green head. You better put those nights spent hacking into camera feeds with that little great perv to good fucking use. The way he jumped in his seat and turned red, it looked like Kaminari shocked himself. I didn't dash. But Bakugo ended the call, leaning back in his chair and running his fingers through his hair. Kirishima pulled back so he could stand up straight while Ida stared at a video like he might be able to do some good just looking at it. 42 villains. According to the most recent report from the police, there were 9 confirmed dead, 4 villains and 5 guards. Innocent people were killed and there was jack shit they could do right now. Bakugo wasn't going to get anywhere stuck in here. He stood. I need some air. Alone. Kirishima and Ida shot each other nervous glances and Kirishima began, I don't think dash. I don't care what you think, Bakugo interrupted. I need some fucking air and I need you two to stop hovering over me so I can think. He pulled a hoodie out of the closet by the door and dragged it over his head while he slipped on a pair of shoes. I'll just be 2 stories up on the roof. If I so much as catch a glimpse of one of you, I'm blowing you off it. He left Kirishima and Ida standing awkwardly in his living room and made his way to the stairwell. True to his word, he went to the roof, but not for the fresh air. The prison break kept bouncing around in his head. It did feel like it was pointed toward him somehow, like how Deku had killed villains in Uraraka's sector to impress her. He couldn't figure out why, just that it did. Something was about to happen. Things were going to change. The first step was the roof. Bakugo sat on the rooftop until the sun completely set and the stars and moon lit up the sky. He lived in a decently lit part of town so he could still see well. So lost in his thoughts, he almost didn't hear a swish of air and the sound of someone walking behind him. Taking a deep breath, he pushed himself up to stand and flexed his fingers before turning around to face his new rooftop companion. Did you see the news? Deku asked, a delighted smile on his face. I knew you'd fight to be alone afterward. You're deceptively intelligent. I've always admired that about you, Kaken. Every time Bakugo pictured seeing Deku again, he thought he'd react quickly, leap to attack Deku or blow him into the sky. Of course, when Deku appeared before him, he did neither of those things. The second he heard his old nickname, Bakugo froze, just as Uraraka had. It was him. It was really Deku. He wore a similar suit to the one had when visiting Uraraka, except with a green shirt and black gloves, like he was a chauffeur for some rich person. And then there was his tie, which was too short. It made no fucking sense, and Bakugo was suddenly overwhelmed by the fact that he didn't know what he was supposed to do. The prison break was you? Bakugo forced out. They really should do something about their security, Deku mused. It was a bit like how he rambled his thoughts out loud under his breath. One punch was all it took to break through the wall. I kinda expected more considering who all was in there. This was surreal. After being gone for almost a year, Deku was acting like he'd only been gone a week, like he hadn't died and they were just having a normal conversation. But this wasn't normal. This was anything but normal. Deku had died. Bakugo watched him save them all and then plummet to his death before using the last of his strength to save Uraraka. Deku was a hero. Bakugo shifted into a defensive position, preparing for the worst. What the hell are you doing here? I thought it was time we had a talk, Deku said. That sounded like something the old Deku would say. The first time they were forced to work together solo on a joint agency mission, Deku tried to pull the same bullshit. They needed to talk. No, they needed to do their damn job. Just like Bakugo needed to show Deku, he couldn't just fuck around with Uraraka like that. However, when Bakugo moved to make an attack, an explosion at the ready in his hand, Deku lifted his right leg up like he was about to march and held it there. I wouldn't do that if I were you. His head tilted in a curious manner. It was so off. Bakugo halted. He didn't have to see Deku's leg to know he was channeling his quirk into it. I wonder what would happen if I destroyed this building. Oh, I know, you'll use your quirk to blast up in the air. Kirishima's quirk will keep him safe. Ida can probably get out in time. But what about all the civilians? How many do you think will survive? None. What the fuck? Bakugo gawked at Deku in horror. This was what Uraraka dealt with on her own? This wasn't just a villain. This was a fucking nightmare. Deku looked genuinely curious about his estimate on how many people would live if he destroyed the building with his quirk. Something hard glimmered in his eyes, a shine Bakugo thought didn't speak of anything good, like he was daring Bakugo to make a move and force his hand into wrecking the place. Like he wanted to do it and was looking for an excuse. Bakugo forced his hands to relax. Deku sighed and put his foot gently back on the ground. How disappointing. You've grown more cautious this past year. He raised an eyebrow. Not as confident perhaps? Did my death shake you up more than you've admitted? I'm plenty fucking confident for the both of us, Bakugo snapped, but the anger felt strangely hollow. It was like he was playing a role in Deku's game, the angry, explosive one to Deku's cool and clever. Deku was toying with him again. Your death didn't do shit to hinder me. Oh, is that why Shudo is ranked above you? Deku asked. Everything skidded to a halted in Bakugo's mind. He stared back at Deku, seeing him but not at the same time. If you asked him, Bakugo would have said he began to push himself even harder after Deku's death, like Uraraka. However, despite racking up an impressive amount of villain takedowns, the details told a slightly different story. There were missteps that shouldn't have happened, sloppy mistakes, and Bakugo couldn't explain them. What really struck him was Deku's knowledge. While masquerading as dead, Deku had kept tabs on him. He'd paid attention, watching Bakugo from afar, maybe Todoroki too. Had the League been spying on all of them, or had Deku done his own personal digging? You know, I could take care of that for you, Deku offered, a familiar, helpful look on his face. Bakugo hated that look. Once upon a time, it made him believe Deku thought him weak when apparently he was just being nice. Bakugo honestly couldn't tell if it was the same now or the opposite. Deku appeared so genuine that Bakugo hesitated. But he didn't like where this was going. What are you talking about, Deku? I can get him out of the way, Deku said excitedly, holding his hands out. I don't particularly want to, but I'll kill Shudo, and endeavor to, for good measure, and that'll open a path for you to the top. The words coming out of his mouth were so terrible, so out of place, so wrong that Bakugo actually took an involuntary step back. He'd never done that with Deku before, he always pushed himself forward. The only time he had even come close to this was after the conclusion of their first fight during their combat training simulation at UA. The shock of experiencing Deku's quirk and finding out everything he thought he knew was wrong had thrown him off. This new Deku and his flip between casual and excited threats of violence made Bakugo feel as if he'd been hit by Uraraka's zero-gravity quirk and he was floating in space with no idea of when he would come down. "All you have to do," Deku continued, a quiet intensity in his voice now as he stepped into the light, "is leave Ochako alone." Bakugo snapped out of it and glared furiously. "What? Kaken, don't play stupid with me now," Deku scolded. He pulled something out from behind him and tossed it onto the ground in between them. Bakugo dragged his eyes down to look at the object. A folder, splayed open, with dozens of pictures of him and Uraraka in the past 10 months. Sitting at a cafe talking over coffee, getting drinks at a bar near his agency, a large group of them celebrating his birthday, the two of them in their hero outfits working together. There was even one of him holding the door open for her and glaring back at someone while his hand hovered over the small of her back. Someone had been keeping very close tabs on them. What was it Uraraka told him? The League had shown Deku pictures of them together to prove to him she was getting closer to Bakugo? This had been their way to point Deku in his direction and turn him into their weapon. They used Uraraka to turn him against them. It felt like a violation. All this time they had been mourning him, trying to move on with their lives, and someone was following them. It made his skin crawl. "While I appreciate you taking care of her while I was gone," Deku continued, "you're not needed anymore. You've been a good friend, but that's my responsibility now. I want you to leave her alone." "Like hell I am." Any semblance of pleasantries vanished from Deku's face in a flash, replaced by a cold, dead look in his eyes. "I'm not going to ask you again nicely, Kaken." Bakugo sneered. "Or what?" When Deku simply replied, "Or I kill everyone you've ever remotely cared about," Bakugo knew he was telling the damn truth. There was no hesitation in his voice, no trembling in his body, not a single blink or flinch. He didn't say it out of anger or desperation to get what he wanted. He would not hold back out of uncertainty. It would be simple retribution for Bakugo not listening. Still, Bakugo wasn't the kind of person to back down even when threatened. He could hear that stupid half-and-half bastard warning him not to rile up Deku, but he didn't give a shit. If this was how Deku wanted to do it, then Bakugo was going to take him down first. "Fucking try me," Bakugo snarled, "but I'm not letting you near Uraraka." Small explosions burst around his hands in preparation. Deku didn't flinch, but a hard expression fell over his face. "You're out of your mind, Deku. If you try anything with her, I'll beat the ever-loving shit out you. I'm not letting you hurt her." That struck a chord. Deku's hands shook, even after he formed them into fists, the black gloves stretching over his knuckles. "Hurt her? You don't have to worry about that. I would never hurt her." His voice turned a little hysterical, his green eyes bright in all the wrong ways. "I love her." He pointed a shaky finger at Bakugo. "You're the one that's gonna hurt her. Look at you. All you do is destroy things, Kaken. That's all you're capable of. I love her. She loves me. Me. Then what the hell do you call those bruises on her wrists, you bastard?" Bakugo shouted back. Deku snapped like a twig. 1 second he was ready to explode and then he completely shut down. Slowly, like he was being rebooted, his entire body started trembling. I didn't," he blinked, stunned. "I wouldn't." Had he really not known what he was doing when he grabbed her too hard? Had he lost control without realizing it? "I would never." "She knows." Bakugo was struck by Deku's sudden shift and he knew. It was him. It was Deku. He was still fucking in there somewhere. Damn it, Uraraka was right. But Bakugo was probably the last person on Earth capable of actually dragging the real Deku back into the light. If anything, he'd make things worse. Even now, as Deku shook like a leaf in front of him, it was mention of Uraraka that did the trick. Deku shoved his fingers into his green hair and bent over in half, staring at the ground. "No, no, no," he kept muttering as he violently shook his head. "No, no, no." Bakugo saw it coming a mile away. Deku was spiraling, but even worse, he was activating his quirk. Torn between two identities, he was coming apart at the seams and the result would only end in destruction. He had to be stopped before that happened. With Deku distracted, Bakugo took his chance, rushing forward to attack, but then Deku's eyes snapped to his at the last second. They were somehow wild and dead at the same time, glowing dimly. It was too late to correct himself. Deku snatched him by his collar with the superhuman speed of his quirk and threw him into the ground hard enough to crack the roof. Bakugo gasped in pain and shock, the wind knocked out of his lungs. Instead of finishing him off, Deku stumbled backward and ran his fingers through his hair. He tilted his head toward the night sky and took deep breaths. Oh, Kaken, that was very rude. He didn't move toward Bakugo, allowing him to drag himself to his feet. Sounds from behind the door warned him that Kirishima and Ida were on their way. Using Ochako like that to upset me. I didn't mean to hurt her, of course. I'll have to make it up to her somehow. You're not getting anywhere near her. Bakugo grit out through the pain, holding onto his right side. Deku might have broken a rib or two. At least it wasn't his back. Shit, that hurt, and Deku hadn't even used half his strength. We won't let you. Deku dropped his head to look at Bakugo. Do you mean Shudo? He let out a disappointed sigh. I miss him too, but if he tries to keep Ochako away from me, I'll have to kill him and not to help you. He held his hands out, palms up in a shrug, as if there was nothing to be done. I'll probably have to anyway. It's a shame, but what can you do? Not kill him? Wasn't that an option? Deku was far too casual about it. The door to the stairs burst open and Ida came to a skidding halt. He was too stunned at first to do or say anything until Kirishima appeared behind him. Bakugo could read their thoughts easily. They'd believed Uraraka, of course, and knew Deku was alive, but hearing about it and seeing him in the flesh were two different things. Kirishima hesitantly stepped forward, hands slightly outreached, but then Ida stopped him with an arm held out against his chest like a bar. Deku brightened, beaming at them and even waving cheerfully. Hi guys. Midoriya? Ida called out. Sorry I can't stay to chat, Deku said in that same happy voice. Catch? Once again, Bakugo was blindsided, but this time he hadn't had time to move. In less than a blink of the eye, Deku grabbed Bakugo by the arm and launched him at Kirishima and Ida. Bakugo shouted at them to move, unable to use his quirk to slow himself down without burning them, but they were so shocked by the contrast between Deku's sudden violence and cheerful demeanor they stood stock still. He crashed into them like a truck, throwing them back inside the stairwell and against a wall. Fuck! Bakugo shouted, half in pain, half in anger. He shoved Ida off him and scrambled to his feet. He glanced back at the other two. Ida sat still against the wall with his glasses askew on his face. Kirishima had fared better. He'd used his hardening quirk to protect himself. Fuck, no wonder Bakugo felt like he'd slammed through 5 layers of concrete. Kirishima tried to grab the back of his hoodie. Oh, wait dash. It didn't matter. Bakugo knew before he ran onto the roof that Deku was gone. He'd probably leaped from the roof a second after throwing Bakugo like a frisbee. The only signs of his presence, that he'd been real and breathing and very much alive, were the broken concrete where he slammed Bakugo and the folder containing the surveillance photos. Bakugo watched as the photos skidded around and blew in the wind, one floating to his feet. He picked it up. The photo was of him and Uraraka. They were both wearing their hero costumes, looking a little scuffed up from a fight they recently finished, destruction surrounding them. Uraraka was mid-yell, telling off another hero for probably endangering civilians. She looked like a hot mess and was pissed as hell, but her eyes shined with passion. He stood to her right, arms folded across his chest, but he was gazing at her with a faint, proud smirk. Had he been someone else, he might have thought his expression was soft, but that didn't make sense. None of this made sense. Bakugo? Kirishima prompted, coming up from behind him and glancing at the picture. We have to warn Todoroki, Bakugo said, folding the picture and shoving it in his pocket. Looks like he made it on Deku's shit list. He thought about Deku's casual threat to kill everyone if he didn't get out of Uraraka's life and then back to Todoroki's warning to stay away from her. He might have put a target on everyone's backs, but he didn't think Deku would hesitate to take out anyone that got in his way, regardless of what Bakugo said or did. It was a shitty thing to think. Uraraka was toweling her hair dry in her bedroom when she heard a phone ringing. The ringtone was some pop dance song, so she was caught off guard when Todoroki answered it. Yes? There was only time for a few words to be said on the other end before he exclaimed, Are you kidding me? I told you to keep an eye on him at all times. Bakugo. Her heart leapt into her throat. Something had happened, something clearly not good. Uraraka dropped the towel and burst into the living room to find Todoroki on the phone standing to the side of one of her windows, peering carefully out the blinds to look out into the street. Tsu was by the front door, having just come back from a perimeter check no doubt. Uraraka focused on Todoroki. What's going on? Is Bakugo okay? Todoroki connected eyes with her and nodded his head. Relief blossomed in Uraraka's chest, but she still felt tense. How bad? He sighed and pulled away from the blinds, letting them fall back into place. Serves him right for pulling a stunt like that. He knew damn well what would happen. It was hard for her to deal with simply listening to only one half of the conversation, especially since it was the half with no information. She could only attempt to piece together what was happening from Todoroki's responses. Tsu came to stand beside her, but Uraraka was so focused on him that she didn't notice or look away. What had Bakugo done? It had been something that irritated Todoroki, but he didn't appear super concerned. Then again, he was good at hiding how he felt. If it was really bad, he'd be doing more than talking on the phone. Just as I suspected, Midoriya's focus is on Uraraka. We're all targets in this. If anyone wants out, Todoroki was passive and straightforward, turning his body from her slightly. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't want anyone to get hurt because of her. If it came to that, she'd need to get away from everyone and try to deal with this on her own. She needed to get through to Deku. I agree. We owe it to him. He wouldn't give up on any of us. And whether he thinks it or not now, he'd want us to protect her from him. She knew that Todoroki was right. If it had been anyone else in his position, Deku would have gone to the ends of the earth to save them, no matter the cost. He'd given his life to save hers. Just the thought of him out there, not being a hero, made breathing difficult. Uraraka pressed a hand to her chest while Tsu rubbed her back soothingly. Her best friend had been an exceptional source of comfort, but it made Uraraka feel guilty. She tried to be strong for Tsu as well, but she didn't feel like she'd done a good job. Todoroki accepted comfort with as much indifference as he did insults. Todoroki suddenly tilted his head in thought. That's troubling, I suppose. Uraraka took an involuntary step forward, but he didn't notice. Well, it's not entirely unexpected. I had a feeling it would happen. On a purely combat basis, I'm the biggest threat. Despite being on the phone, she could hear sudden shouting on the other end and knew right away that Bakugo was arguing against Todoroki's assessment. He offered to do what? It's almost like he's trying to be nice, in a way. It was killing Uraraka not to know exactly what was being said. Next time, she'd force Todoroki to put the phone on speaker, although she had an inkling that he hadn't done it now, so she wouldn't try to hijack the conversation or go into a panic before everything was explained. Her patience was wearing thin. While she loved Tsu and adored Todoroki, she couldn't stand being stuck in her apartment for much longer, and no doubt Bakugo was faring worse. Kirishima was his best friend, but he and Ito were like oil and water, and he liked his space. If I have to meet him head-on, I will, but I really would prefer it to be outside of the city. Todoroki frowned and Uraraka's stomach did a flip. The city. If Deku did come here and Todoroki had to defend them, the collateral damage would be immense. Who knew how many people would get caught up in it? Todoroki would be as careful as possible, but she knew that this new Deku wouldn't hesitate to bring a building down. After finding out about the prison break, she'd gone to hide in the shower. No one said anything, but they didn't have to. She'd seen Deku's quirk up close enough times to know what its outcome looked like. How could she have been so foolish? So selfish? She couldn't stay here. Uraraka looked around her apartment, already mourning it even though she'd grown despondent over how empty it had felt before. There were so many memories of Deku here, so many bright points in her life that she was loath to leave behind. Then she thought of the other morning when he appeared in her living room. She didn't want to taint the good with the bad. We will. Keep an eye out, though I don't think you'll need to be worried. He's coming here. I know him. The second Todoroki hung up, Uraraka was on him, pulling away from Tsu. We need to leave. Now, judging from the way Todoroki was gazing at her calmly, she figured that her response had been what he was expecting. Are you certain? Uraraka bit her lip. I don't want anyone else to get caught up in this. She looked down at her feet, suddenly ashamed that she hadn't considered civilians and that she was thinking so poorly of Deku. We don't know what he's willing to do. We barely even know what he wants. I don't want to find out the hard way. She took a deep breath and gave Todoroki a determined look. The fact is, my being here puts innocent lives in harm's way. I hate it enough that you all are in jeopardy. Todoroki pocketed his cell phone. We're heroes. This is part of the job, just a little more personal. He was so calm about it, so straightforward. Both he and Tsu were, although Tsu was more open about how upset she was over everything. Still, when she looked him directly in the eyes, she saw the hint of uncertainty in them. The fear of the unknown. You can admit that you're afraid of what will happen when you see Deku, Uraraka told him quietly. As if he'd been waiting for someone to call him out on it, or maybe afraid that they would. Todoroki broke eye contact with her and rubbed his face, the first obvious sign that he'd given that this was deeply troubling him. I don't want to hurt him. We're both capable of mass amounts of destruction, but I don't want to get to that level. I'm worried that he won't give me a choice. He looked down at his hands. I'm worried that he'll push me to that brink on purpose. He did it once before, did he not? Tsu put in. At our first sports festival. Yeah, but that was to help me, Todoroki said. This would be to hurt me. It's a twisted version of him, like how he's killing villains in order to please Uraraka and get her attention. It made her feel sick. She hated how there were so many hints of the old Deku in him, but they were distorted. Midoriya showed up to confront Bakugo. Uraraka gasped. Is he? He's fine. 2 broken ribs, but I think his ego is what's mostly damaged, Todoroki told her. That still didn't stop Uraraka's heart from feeling like it was going to beat right out of her chest. She had more or less figured it out, but hearing it up front was still terrifying. He'd probably been much braver than her. A lot less crying, that was for certain. It was what he'd wanted, but it clearly hadn't turned out the way he would have liked. As predicted, he told Bakugo to stay away from you. I bet Bakugo did not. Like that? Tsu said, shaking her head. He reacted about as well as we can expect, but Kirishima said that he didn't try to fight Midoriya immediately. I think actually seeing Midoriya in person took Bakugo off guard more than he anticipated. Todoroki was so analytical about it, but she could see that he was wondering if he would fall victim to the same reaction. Out of everyone, he and Tsu had spent the longest time with her searching for Deku. He'd ran himself past ragged. He admitted to being behind the prison break, so it's clear that he has a goal for the league outside of you. She had known it was him, but she didn't like hearing it. During his time as a hero, Deku had helped capture many of the villains locked up in that prison, as had some of the others. There were villains in there that had only ever known Deku as a hero and their enemy. Now he'd broken them out after putting them in there. She couldn't imagine the insanity right now. However, she recalled him mentioning how he'd killed the villains in her sector instead of recruiting them. If any of these newly freed villains acted out of line, she didn't think they'd last long. Gods, what was she thinking? 2 of Deku's best features were that he was so forgiving and kind. She had loved him for it so much. He had such a good heart. A rather thoughtful look crossed Todoroki's face. Deku offered to kill me and endeavored to give Bakugo a clearer path to the top if he left you alone. Uraraka paled and straightened up in shock. Oh my god, that's awful. I'm sorry. The idea that Deku would even consider doing something like that was overwhelmingly painful. Todoroki had been Deku's best friend. They'd grown inseparable in their own way over the years. Deku had trusted him with everything, believed in and supported him, loved him even like a brother. He did say that he missed me and killing me would be a shame, so there's that, I suppose, Todoroki added, like it was no big deal when it clearly very much was. She watched the way he shifted on his feet and how he wouldn't meet her eyes again. Deku's offer and words had affected him. It was going to come down to it anyways. If it's not Bakugo keeping you from him, it's one of us. I felt like I was the most logical choice. I'd hoped that he might be more hesitant if it was me, but that doesn't seem to be the case. At any rate, if I'm not a threat with you, I would be for the League of Villains. It was too much. Uraraka wasn't sure how much more she could take, and yet she knew that it would have to be much more. This was just the beginning. All they could do was roll with every punch and fight back. They couldn't give up. It didn't make it any easier to accept though. How can you talk so practically about this? She asked. He was just so clinical about the whole thing that it was beginning to drive her up a wall. Maybe it was just her nerves. Maybe she'd been around Bakugo too much. Todoroki gave her a look that for the briefest of moments showed a pain in him that very much mirrored her own. Because if I allow myself to feel all of it, I don't know if I'll be able to fight him. He shut it away, hiding everything from her again, but she was grateful that he opened up to her even for a second. Because I don't know if I'll be strong enough. And if I'm not, he shook his head, like he was getting rid of those thoughts or at least hiding them. That's not an option. It sounded like something the old Deku would say. Accept your fear and then move past it to save the day. Come, Yuchako, Sue said, tugging on her arm. We need to pack if we're going to leave. Where are we going? Uraraka asked. I'll figure that out while you're getting ready, Todoroki said decisively. We need to alert the others to our move. And I think it's time we warned you. Perhaps it was wrong of us not to tell them earlier. He carefully glanced through the blinds again, but seemed appeased by what he saw, or what he didn't see. I'm concerned that Midoriya's focus might swing to All Might at some point. He's focused on you, but he's also proven erratic and not opposed to killing any of us if it's necessary. Tsu gulped. You don't think? I don't know, Todoroki sighed, exhaustion evident in his voice again. Had he slept any in the past 2 days? To be honest, Uraraka couldn't be sure. She'd barely got sleep, but it was necessary to keep them in top shape in case a fight did come about. I honestly don't know. What made Uraraka feel even worse was that she didn't know either. She would swear up and down that Deku wouldn't hurt her, showing the bruises on her wrist to Tsu and Todoroki had caused a lot of hubris. But at the end of the day, she didn't know what he was capable of doing at all. She didn't know what he was willing to do or what he wanted to do. It didn't make any sense. She had always known what was in his heart and now. She couldn't even be sure what was going on in his mind. If it was even his thoughts to begin with. Were you Deku? Uraraka thought aimlessly. While Uraraka packed a bag with a separate one that included her Uravity gear, Tsu set about telling everyone that they were moving to a safer location. Everyone mostly replied back to Tsu in the affirmative and to contact them if they needed help with the transfer, except for Bakugo, who sent Uraraka a personal text that said, "Fucking finally." It was the first time she'd spoken to him since his encounter with Deku and she was itching to call him, but knew that they didn't have the time for a chat on the phone. She'd have to either settle calling him on the way or sending him a flurry of texts if she wanted to remain more private. It bothered her that she thought that her conversation with Bakugo over Deku should be private, even though everyone likely knew most of the details already. What had Deku done? What had he said exactly? She wished she could have been there, though a small part of her was relieved that she hadn't. She didn't know what she would have done if she'd heard Deku say that he was willing to kill Todoroki. It would have shattered her heart into pieces. And then he'd broken 2 of Bakugo's ribs, although she wasn't certain how. The fight had clearly not gone in any way that Bakugo had planned. She was scared. She was upset. She was angry. It was like Deku was using her as an excuse to hurt other people and their friends, and she hated it. Maybe if he'd just been a plain old evil villain, it wouldn't have wounded so much, but he'd dragged her into it and she didn't know how to stop him or if she even could. She was really afraid that the only way to get him to not hurt anyone she cared about was to go along with him, but she couldn't do that. She wasn't even sure what that would mean. He couldn't possibly be expecting her to join him in the league, could he? You ready? Todoroki asked. Uraraka nodded her head and slung her bags over her shoulders. It would have been easy to use her quirk on them, but she wanted to save her strength as much as possible just in case. No extra usage of her quirk unless absolutely necessary. She cast her apartment, her home with Deku, one last glance over. Tsu laid a hand on her arm. It's not goodbye. I know, Uraraka sighed. I just hate feeling like I'm running away. It was the logical choice. She knew it now. However, they all knew it would come with a new set of consequences. If Deku got it in his head that they were trying to steal Uraraka away from him, there was a very high possibility that he would go on a rampage. He had been capable of damage before when he was a hero. She did not want to think of what he would inflict now as a villain. It's not him, Uraraka told herself. Deku was a hero in her heart and mind and always would be. We're going to UA first, Todoroki told them as they got in his car. It was nice. Uraraka offhandedly hoped to the gods that he had good insurance, just in case Deku decided to pop in for a visit. I spoke with Aizawa. He has a safe house that he used back in his pro-hero days. Uraraka swallowed. Did you tell them? Todoroki connected eyes with her in the rearview mirror. It was safer if she stayed in the back seat out of sight. His windows were tinted dark enough where she could hide there. Yes, there wasn't the time to wait until we could do it face to face, and I thought you might want a break from having to explain it again. Relief and exhaustion threatened to swallow Uraraka whole, but all she could think was how much she appreciated her friends. The more she explained what had become of Deku, the more desolate she became, like every mention of that morning chipped away at the memory of who he'd been before. Telling their former teachers had been a burden that Todoroki had lifted from her shoulders. How did All Might take it? Uraraka asked, her gaze falling on the buildings that they passed by. Devastated, shocked, ashamed, Todoroki said, like he was listing what was on a menu. I don't think it's said in fully. He partially blames himself for Deku's death and now this. No one pushed Deku harder than he did. Uraraka smiled sadly. Not true. Deku did. Yeah, Todoroki agreed quietly, his eyes focused on the road. He did. I'd never met anyone with such determination before, Tsu added. He really made you want to become a better hero, right from the start? They had all been determined to become heroes in their own way when they'd first joined UA. For Uraraka, she had wanted to make enough money to give her parents a comfortable life, and while she had done that, it wasn't the only reason she was a hero now. The idea that she had the ability to save lives meant so much to her. If she could save Deku now, if she could keep Bakugo, Todoroki, and all her friends safe. It's that determination I'm worried about now, Todoroki admitted, his white knuckles on the steering wheel betraying his collected voice. He never once gave up, no matter what he was up against, no matter how many times he had to break himself. That's incredible in a hero, but dangerous in a villain. It didn't help that they didn't know what Deku's exact plan was or what he wanted. They had some vague ideas, but beyond Uraraka and something that involved a lot of powerful villains, they couldn't be sure. Without that, they were having a hard time coming up with a plan. The three of them had spent the past 2 days coordinating and talking with the others, trying to figure out something beyond keeping out of Deku's reach. It wasn't just Bakugo that was getting antsy and reckless. They were close to UA, about 10 minutes out, when Todoroki slammed on the brakes so hard that Uraraka jerked forward and hit the back of Tsu's seat despite wearing a seatbelt. His face was as pale as his knuckles now, lips pressed into a thin line, and his entire body was pulled like a tightly coiled spring. Uraraka rubbed her head and moved to follow his gaze as she reached out to touch him on the shoulder and then froze. Standing in the middle of the road about 30 meters ahead of them was Deku. He was wearing a costume that was similar to his pro-hero one, but not at the same time. The colors were wrong, black where it had been green and red or green instead of gray or white. It looked as if he had a hood that could be pulled over to cover his eyes and a mask that could cover the bottom half of his face, but he was letting himself be seen by them now. He wanted them to know who it was, that it was him. An unnatural fog or perhaps smoke rolled through the street, partially hiding Deku, but he simply stood in their way, his hands hanging at his side. Slowly, the fog began to fade away, only to reveal that Deku wasn't alone. 5 other villains in equally horrifying costumes stood behind him, 2 on his left and 3 on his right. Knowing that they would have to face Deku sooner or later was one thing, but being confronted with 6 villains was something else. It was the kind of thing villains did when they didn't want to leave anyone behind. Todoroki gritted his teeth when he recognized one of them. Dabi. Uraraka's eyes latched onto the dark-clad figure standing to the left of Deku. He was easily recognizable by the purple skin that hung from his jaw and below his eyes. There were more burns to him now, more scars, and he was thinner as well, probably from his time in prison, but it was him. The fact that Deku had brought him along was a direct slap to the face. After what he'd done to Bakugo, after what Todoroki had gone through to bring him down, and now he was back in their lives. She knew that he'd picked Dabi on purpose. Dabi was probably ecstatic that the boy who had desperately tried to save Bakugo from the League of Villains was now a part of them. Tsu broke the tense silence and spoke what they were all thinking. Todoroki, we cannot fight them. I don't think we have a choice, Todoroki responded, never once looking away from the 5 villains. Uraraka knew that he was trying to come up with a plan, calculate what he could possibly do to get them out of here. None of them wanted to just run away, but there was no way that they could get through them either. Todoroki was one of the strongest heroes she knew, and she'd seen him take down multiple villains on his own even when they had been just students. But so had Deku. He knew exactly how Todoroki worked and how to defeat him too. As if he knew that Todoroki had come up with the same conclusion, Deku lifted a hand in the air and grinned. Todoroki was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that he was almost shaking. Tsu, call UA and alert them that we need reinforcements. They're the closest. Uraraka, his eyes finally moved away from the villains and he caught hers in the rearview mirror, call Bakugo. At least Ida might be able to arrive in time. In time for what? Uraraka asked, even though she knew in her heart what his answer was. Before someone dies, Todoroki told her, focused on the villains again. He forced his body to relax, his arms going slack and his grip loosening. I'll hold Deku and the others off for as long as I can. That's suicide, Uraraka exclaimed, gripping the back of his seat. I'll go with you, Tsu said. No, Todoroki swung to look at Tsu. I need you to stay with Uraraka. We don't know if they have backup. There could be more villains lurking. He closed his eyes and took a few deep breaths. The villains were still waiting, giving them time to consider their situation. It wasn't good, no matter what way they looked at it. Todoroki was smart and strong, but there was only one of him and at least 6 of them, and they all knew how Deku worked. At least the Deku of old. She had a feeling this new Deku was different. He wouldn't be so cautious. I didn't want it to be this way, Todoroki said under his breath. Tsu pulled out her phone and called UA, her eyes flickering around them to get as much of an understanding of their situation as she could. Uraraka sent their location to Bakugo's cell, but then leaned forward to put her hand on Todoroki's shoulder, causing him to open his eyes. I know this is to protect me, but I'm here to protect you too. If it gets too much for you, I'm going in. Maybe it'll stop Deku, if only for a moment. She hardened her resolve. Don't forget, I'm a hero too. A ghost of a smile crossed Todoroki's face, so faint and brief that she couldn't tell if it was there. I know. Oi, Shoto, Deku called out. Are you going to come out to play or not? He put his hands on his hips. After all the trouble I went through to greet you properly too. Todoroki frowned. At least he thinks highly of me still. Right then, Bakugo called and Uraraka didn't get a single moment to say anything before he started in on her, anger lacing every single one of his words. What the fuck, Uraraka? Is it Deku already? And a few others, including Dabi, Uraraka told him, her eyes locked on Todoroki as he opened the door and slowly got out. She turned to watch Deku, who actually seemed happy. He even held his arms out like he was opening himself up for a hug. A wonderful reunion between 2 best friends. Bakugo swore. That bastard. I'll fucking kill him. She wasn't sure if he was talking about Deku or Dabi, probably both. Hang tight. We're already on our way. Hurry, Uraraka said, though it didn't need to be said. She didn't know how long Todoroki could last. She hoped the entire time and then some. He was strong, she kept reminding herself. She just didn't know if he was strong enough. It didn't matter. He had to be. That was it. Shoto, Deku greeted. I missed you. Todoroki shut the car door and then walked around to stand in front of it, the headlights causing an unearthly glow around him. I missed you as well. The two stared each other down. I don't want to do this. Deku shrugged his shoulders. You're not giving me much of an option. He held up a finger and wagged it, shaming Todoroki like a child. Trying to take Ochako and hide her away from me. What kind of friend does that? You're supposed to be supportive of our relationship. And Todoroki had been supportive, more than anything. She could see him struggling now. It was a battle in itself facing Deku when he was like this. Seeing him again made Uraraka want to scream. She both wanted to jump out of the car and run to him and also get into the driver's seat and drive away. The two desires clashed so painfully that she ended up doing neither one of them. "I'm protecting her," Todoroki said. "It's what you would have wanted." The smile was dashed away from Deku's face, replaced by a horrible shadow as he clenched his fists and prepared himself for a fight. She'd seen that stance more than 100 times. Before, it had inspired her and let her know that everything was going to be all right. Now it instilled fear in her heart. "What I want," Deku began in a growl before raising his voice into a shout, "is Ochako and for you to leave us the hell alone. I want us to be happy." "You think she's happy that you're like this now?" Todoroki countered angrily, fissures appearing in his composure. She will be," Deku promised. Uraraka sunk into the back seat. She would never be happy seeing Deku like this. She wanted him back to normal. She wanted him home. The thought that she would rather him be still dead than become this devastated her. "They promised me that they would let her live, but I've got to cover my bases. She won't be fully safe unless she's at my side. I'm being the logical one here, Shoto. You all are putting her in danger. I'm trying to keep her alive." "You're not making any sense," Todoroki told him. "You think she'd be safe around villains?" "Well, she's not safe around you or Kaken," Deku scoffed, like it was obvious. "You two have to be killed. Orders are orders." Todoroki slid his feet into a fighting stance. The time for talking was coming to an end. He'd done what he could to keep Deku talking for as long as possible. An easier feat than expected, seeing as how Deku still had a habit of going off on tangents and getting lost in his head. "Do you do everything you're told?" Deku grabbed part of his mask hanging around his neck and said, "Only when they line up with what I want and, well, I should at least thank you for bringing her to me. You were always a good friend." He put on only the bottom half of his mask, locking it into place over his mouth, jaw, and nose. It made him look demonic with the red and green stitching against the black like a terrible grin. It made it so that his eyes glowed like lights and his hair stuck out on end. Green lightning glowed from Deku's position as he launched himself forward faster than the light itself. Todoroki countered with an explosion of flames as large as the surrounding buildings, which he fluidly followed with an immense wall of ice to his left that blocked but was destroyed by Dabi's blue flames just as big as his orange ones. The result left the whole area shaking like an earthquake, windows shattering and the car rumbling dangerously. Uraraka had never seen anything like it before, and she'd seen Todoroki's fights up close multiple times. This was something different though. This was on a level that very few could understand. When the smoke cleared, Todoroki was gone from the front of the car, using the ice half of his quirk to skate along the walls of a building and counter Dabi's flames with his own. Deku slammed into the ice just a hair behind Todoroki, but it knocked him off balance and he fell to the ground. He rolled when he landed to minimize damage and then popped up to engage with another villain she didn't recognize. He snatched the villain with his left hand and ignited his flames. While he shifted his right foot, an ice burst from him, coating the street and shooting up a wall of ice spikes towards Deku, who was standing in the hole of a building he'd just created. The one villain couldn't avoid Todoroki's flames, but Deku smashed through the ice and leaped to attack Todoroki from behind. It was too much. Todoroki could have handled Deku on his own perhaps, but not like this. The other villains weren't on their level by a long shot, with Dabi as the exception, but they were distractions and that was just enough to give Deku the upper hand. Todoroki threw the villain he had a hold of like a sandbag at Deku. Despite being on the same team, Deku knocked the villain out of his way so hard that his body flew towards the car and smashed into it, nearly knocking them on the side. When Tsu glanced down at him, she shook her head. He wasn't moving. Uraraka didn't think he would any time soon or at all. It had given Todoroki enough time to dodge Deku, using his ice to skate away again. Dabi used his quirk to force Todoroki to change course, putting him right in the way of a villain who began to crackle with a wild amount of electricity. Todoroki clapped his hands together just as an electric shock surged towards him, the combination of his quirks resulting in a huge burst of steam and smoke that covered the entire area. Uraraka watched as green and red lightning streaked through the smoke, Deku's quirk a beacon of light and fear. "Are you hiding, Shoto?" Deku's disembodied voice demanded. "That's not like you." It wasn't. Todoroki was being overwhelmed and they all knew it. If he was hit even once, it would spell only doom for him. He was also using his quirk at near maximum every single time. They were pushing him to the brink of his quirk. Dabi only used his flames at their maximum temperature, and Deku wasn't fooling around with only 15 or 20% of his power. They were going to bring Todoroki to the edge of his limit and force him to lose control. A shadow caught Uraraka's attention, and she latched onto it as the smoke cleared around them. It was Todoroki. He was breathing heavily and had a hand on his side. His shirt looked singed. He must have been struck by part of the villain's electricity before being able to create the steam and dodge. Still, he didn't look even close to giving up, the resolve etched onto his face. One villain was already down. He's going to fight until they kill him, Uraraka realized. Todoroki let off another explosion of fire so bright that it blinded everyone and followed it with a slick of ice that erupted from the ground like a volcanic explosion underneath two of the villain's feet. The ice threw them in the air and caught them midway, encasing them within a wall of ice that was almost 3 meters thick so that there was no way they could move or get out. It was incredible but left him no time to properly dodge Dabi's attack. Todoroki threw up a smaller wall of ice as he fell backwards, but Dabi's fire broke through it so hard that it knocked Todoroki off his feet and into the side of a building with enough force to knock someone unconscious. It didn't him though, but it came close. Todoroki crumpled onto his hands and knees, gasping for air, as Deku casually walked up to him and pulled his mark down to hang around his neck, red light crackling around his right arm. Todoroki swung up his left arm, fire coming out even as he struggled to breathe, but Deku knocked his arm away and the flames died, reminding Uraraka of that moment they had come head-to-head in the cavalry battle, their first sports festival. Snatching Todoroki by the front of his shirt, Deku slammed him against the wall, hard enough to break bones, and a pained shout slipped out of Todoroki. "No!" Uraraka screamed in the car, jerking the handle to kick the car door open. "Ochako, you can't!" Tsu shouted, using her tongue to wrap around Uraraka and jerk her back. Without thinking, Uraraka touched Tsu's tongue and activated her quirk. Tsu floated to the ceiling and, taken off guard, loosened her grip on Uraraka enough so that she could slip out of it and throw herself out of the car. "Stop it, Deku!" Everyone stilled in the wake of her scream, the only movement coming from the smoke of Dabi's fire and the steam created when it had hit Todoroki's ice. Uraraka was practically shaking, whether from anger or fear, she wasn't for sure. All she knew was that she couldn't stand to see Todoroki hurt anymore. She couldn't watch as Deku hurt his best friend. She couldn't take it. She was a hero, damn it. She wasn't going to just hide in a car while she watched one of her closest friends die by the hands of the boy she loved. Deku spun towards her slowly, like he was in a daze. His eyes, so empty and dead as he had fought, began to light up again once they landed on her. A smile even appeared, so dazzling it was like he's standing in front of the sun and couldn't look away. As if he didn't even realize what he was doing, he let go of Todoroki, who fell face first into the ground without trying to soften his landing, and turned to face her completely. "Ochako," Deku said softly, as if seeing her had taken his breath away and not the fight. "I knew you would come to me. They didn't believe me. But I knew you wouldn't let Shoto die on his own. Please," Uraraka begged, unable to move towards him. She couldn't move, as if her ankles had been frozen in place by Todoroki's ice. Deku had to see reason, he had to. She couldn't believe that he would go through with killing someone he'd loved before. "Don't do this, Deku. He's your best friend. Please." Deku blinked at her innocently. "I'd really rather not." He glanced back down at Todoroki's prone body, a slight frown on his face, like he was disappointed but there was nothing to be done about it. He didn't want to kill Todoroki, but he would because it had been deemed necessary. I know he thinks that he's doing what's best, but he's not. Even then, he's too big of a risk for the League. Better to take him out early. Uraraka forced all her tension into her fists to the point where her fingers ached. "I can't let you do that." "Oh, Ochako," Deku sighed with a sad smile on his face. "I admire your strength, I always have, but what can you do that Shoto can't?" "I don't know," Uraraka admitted. Before he could respond, she took off running, directly for Electricity Villain, who seemed startled that she had targeted him instead of Deku, though not displeased. A nasty grin split across his face as he aimed a hand at her and shot off a lighting bolt. Distantly, she heard Deku scream and maybe even Tsu too, but Uraraka ignored them both. She activated her quirk on herself and jumped, clearing the lightning like it was nothing, and then released it so that she slammed her foot right into the villain's chest. It knocked him to the ground and she followed him down and grabbed his arm, reactivating her quirk, and launched him with all her might, quickly releasing it again so that he slammed into a building with all his weight. Even though it pissed her off sometimes, it came in handy when villains underestimated her. She might not be as powerful as Todoroki, Bakugo, or Deku, and she might not have a quirk best suited for combat, but she knew how to fight and she would do so until the bitter end. She would never give up, not until she was out for the count. However, a large ball of Dabi's blue flames from behind caught her off guard and she reacted too late. She spun around, moving to activate her quirk on herself again and try to leap out of the way, when something wrapped around her waist and jerked her out of the way of the flames so fast that it took her breath away. 1 second she had been staring wide-eyed into the flames and the next she found herself underneath a street lamp, dazed and confused. For a brief second, she thought that Tsu had pulled her out of the way, but then familiar strong arms pulled away from her and she turned back around to look at who had saved her. It was Deku. She could feel the power of his quirk surging through his body, red and green light crackling in the air around them both. He was breathing heavily, a bit of sweat on his forehead, and there was a bit of smoke seeping out of the back of his uniform where the flames must have grazed him. His hair hung in his face so that she couldn't see his eyes, and while his grip had loosened on her he hadn't let go, as if he didn't dare in fear that she'd fade away. "Don't," Deku panted low under his breath, "don't do that." Tentatively, scared that he might react poorly, Uraraka went to touch his face, but he snatched her by the wrist, much more careful this time. It still stung because of the bruises and she flinched. His eyes moved to where he was holding onto her and his face twisted into a pained one when he saw the bruises that he'd left. He bit his lip and rubbed a gentle thumb over them, like he could wash them away. Kaken wasn't lying, he murmured to himself. Uraraka didn't dare say anything, worried that if she so much as breathed Bakugo's name, that terrifying jealous Deku would replace this tender one. "I'm sorry, Ochako. I'm not used to having to hold back anymore." He looked her in the eyes, deadly serious and filled with regret. "I'll make it up to you." "Then don't do this," Uraraka pleaded. "Don't hurt your friends." "Come with me," Deku said, almost sounding just as desperate as her. "I can't do that," Uraraka told him in barely a whisper. Instead of getting angry like Uraraka had expected, Deku only nodded his head and let go of her completely. "You're not ready yet." "I understand." It wasn't that. She would never be ready for what Deku wanted. Even if she told him that though, she didn't think he'd believe her right now. "But I can't do what you want either, boss," Dabi drawled, not bothering to hide his sarcasm. Whatever softness that Deku was allowing to bleed out vanished in an instant. "Stay here," he told her, his voice so harsh that Uraraka could only nod her head. He jerked upright and snapped into the direction of Dabi, eyes glaring so viciously that they glowed. He looked and sounded like a completely different person from just seconds ago. "I'll deal with you later." The promise and heat in his voice made Uraraka want to shiver, even though it was directed at someone she loathed. "You try to hurt her again like that and I'll break you in half, Dabi, I swear." Dabi shrugged his shoulders. "She was attacking. I responded out of instinct." "You're lucky I don't kill you now," Deku snapped as he stomped in the direction of Todoroki, who was shakily pushing himself up with Tsu's help. Uraraka begged in her mind for them to get away. "I'm sorry you had to get involved in this, Tsu." There wasn't a hint of regret in his voice. There was nothing. He kept on walking towards them, getting stronger with every step he took. "If you step aside and return to Ochako, I'll spare you." Tsu tightened her grip on Todoroki while he tried to push her away and grumbled, "Hey, get out of here, see?" Despite the fear very evident on her face, Tsu shook her head and continued to help him. Uraraka felt paralyzed. She had to get up. She had to save them. Deku tilted his head back and huffed. "You're making things much more difficult than they have to be." Even though he had told her to stay put, did he think he could scare her into listening? Uraraka finally managed to convince her body to work and she scrambled to her feet. Deku must have heard her or expected her to disobey him because he snapped his fingers and pointed back at her without even looking. Restrain her, please, and do not harm her or you'll find out what it's like to have every single bone in your body broken. Before she could react, a villain they hadn't seen phased out of the ground like the concrete was nothing but sand and snatched her by the arms so that she couldn't touch him. He knocked her legs out from underneath her before she could stomp on his foot and pressed her into the ground with a knee against her back. She would have been able to fight back if he hadn't activated his quirk and sunk her partially into the ground, leaving her to only watch in horror as Deku stopped in front of her friends. Dek, her shout was cut off short by the villain slapping a hand over her mouth. Tsu held onto Todoroki and looked up into Deku's face. Why are you doing this, Midoriya? This isn't you. Deku bent down into a crouch so that he could gaze at them face to face and said, You have no idea who I am. You never did. None of you. You were our friend, Tsu told him. Friends don't leave friends to die, Deku simply replied. We searched for YU for weeks on end. Todoroki managed to ground out through the pain, his hands pressed against the sidewalk to hold himself up. How many bones had been broken? Fire licked the ground from his left hand while ice splintered from his right. We did everything we could. Deku considered them for a moment. Maybe so. It wasn't good enough. You were too weak. With a speed that they all knew wasn't even his top, he abruptly knocked Tsu to the side. She would have crashed into a parked car had she not been able to wrap her tongue around a pole and stop herself. Deku snagged Todoroki by his neck while Todoroki wrapped his hands around Deku's wrist and they both fell into a staring match. Todoroki panted, as if he couldn't suck in enough air. Don't make me do it, Izuku. Do what? Deku asked, a smile curling onto his face. I'm stronger than you, more than you'll ever know. It's sad. We made a great team, but you were never on my level. Both of them moved to activate their quirks at the same time. Deku lifted Todoroki in the air by his neck with one hand while flames and ice wrapped around Deku's wrist, both ready to explode. And then everything just went out like a light. Deku blinked in surprise and squeezed Todoroki's neck almost experimentally, but whatever he'd wanted to happen didn't. He caught sight of the white bands shooting towards him at the last second, dropping Todoroki like a sack of potatoes and leaping out of the way just in time to avoid being caught. In the place where he'd stood just moments ago was Aizawa, his hair out of his face and his goggles on. With the pro-hero Eraserhead now at his side, Todoroki pulled himself to his feet. He rubbed his throat with his right hand while flames appeared in his left. I figured you would call for backup, Deku said, though I can't say that I'm not disappointed. I wanted this to stay between us. They're not the only ones, Todoroki told him. Before Deku could respond, there was a series of loud explosions and Bakugo came barreling out of nowhere, using his quirk to fly at a high power speed, and screaming, Get your hands off of her. The villain holding onto her tried to escape, but one of Bakugo's outstretched hands grasped him by the face and he let out of a violent explosion that ripped both the villain and Uraraka out of the sand-like ground. All three of them went flying, but Uraraka activated her quirk on herself so that she didn't hit the ground and landed on her feet on the side of a building. Bakugo pushed through, still holding onto the villain and firing off explosions. When they finally dropped to the ground, Bakugo landing on his feet and the villain with a thud, his red eyes swung from Uraraka to Deku, wild with rage. Uraraka kicked off from her spot on the wall and landed next to Bakugo, deactivating her quirk so that she'd stay on the ground. Ida appeared at her side as well, skidding to a halt as he let his engines die. Sorry it took us so long. You got here just in time, Uraraka told him. That's all that matters. Bakugo said nothing, just glared at Deku, who stared him down right back with an equally murderous gaze, both of them standing completely still. One thing Uraraka spotted though was that Deku's right fingers were beginning to twitch at his side, tapping against his leg in an erratic manner that he didn't seem to notice. Midoriya! Dabi shouted warningly. I know. Deku snapped, still not looking away from Bakugo. Finally, he took a deep breath and shook his head, his hair flopping in the wind. This is a little too crowded for my taste. He glanced at Todoroki. It was nice seeing you. I'm kind of glad you aren't dead yet. He turned back around and pointed a finger at Bakugo. It was shaking, as if it was taking everything in his power not to go ballistic and outright attack. His eyes kept flickering from Bakugu to Uraraka. I'm stronger than you, Kaken. Remember that. It'll be a pleasure killing you. A warp gate appeared behind him, startling everyone. Kurogyri! Ida shouted. It had been so many years since he had been seen that everyone had thought he died. They all looked around but only saw the gate and not his actual form. Aizawa had to see him and not just one of his warp gates in order to cancel out his quirk. Midnight, who had been hanging back, tore open the sleeve of her shirt to release her sleep-inducing fumes, but then Dabi's flames blew them away. Bakugu shot forward with a roar, but it was too late. It was only a matter of seconds, but when the fire and fog cleared, the warp gate was gone, along with Deku and Dabi. Bakugu's scream of, "Damn it," echoed through the streets, but other than that, no one moved, too shell-shocked over what had just transpired. It was only when Todoroki let his flames die and collapsed to one knee that people snapped out of it. Uraraka rushed over to him, even though Aizawa was already there to help him back up. She reached out to cup his face in her hands, feeling the ice splotches on his right side while his left was flushed and hot. It felt like she was the only thing holding him up. "I told you to stay in the car," Todoroki huffed, clearly struggling to talk. He had one arm wrapped around his chest while the other hung limply at his side. "And I told you that I wouldn't if things looked bad," Uraraka countered fiercely, tears forming in her eyes. He was standing, but he looked so rough. His feet shifted underneath him as he struggled to stay upright. "I'm a hero and I'm not going to let anyone else die for me. Got it?" Todoroki hung his head, nodding it ever so slightly, and then slumped forward. He would have toppled on top of her had Aizawa not grabbed him from behind. "I've got him," Aizawa told her, looking more tired than she'd ever seen him despite the fact that he'd barely done any fighting. It was the type of exhaustion that came from grief. It was hard enough for Uraraka to see Deku like this. For Aizawa to know that his lessons were being put to use like this must have stung bitterly. "We'll take him to Recovery Girl." With present mix help, Aizawa all but carried Todoroki to their vehicle, leaving Uraraka standing by herself in the middle of the street. She looked around the area, taking in the damage. Almost all of it had been caused by Deku and Dabi, but there was still the large wall of ice that had captured two surviving villains, who Cementos and 13 were slowly excavating. Midnight was taking care of the villain's body that was crumpled up against the side of Todoroki's car. Ida was checking over Tsu, who was bruised from Deku's hit but looked more annoyed by Ida's fussing than anything. "What were you thinking, round face? Getting in the middle of the fight like that?" Uraraka turned and found Bakugu standing very close to her. The sleeve of his right shirt was torn and burnt from letting off multiple large explosions. She could ask him the same thing, considering she knew that he had 2 broken ribs and had still thought it was a good idea to launch himself like a missile at a villain. "I was thinking that I didn't want Todoroki to die." "Deku could have hurt you," Bakugu said. "He saved me," Uraraka shot back. Her words took Bakugu off guard for only a second, but it was enough to bleed the fight right out of her. She didn't have the energy to argue with Bakugu right now. She felt about as exhausted as Aizawa looked. Her head dropped and her shoulders slumped. "I would have been hit by Dabi's flames if Deku hadn't pulled me out of the way." She grimaced. "I wouldn't want to be Dabi right now." Deku was not happy. Still, out of everyone that had been involved in the fight, Uraraka was the only one completely uninjured. When the one villain had restrained her, he hadn't actually hurt her, lest he wanted to suffer Deku's wrath. Turned out it hadn't mattered since he'd suffered Bakugu's in the end. Deku had even managed to get burned by Dabi when he had saved her. And the way he'd rubbed her wrist so gently, the regret in his voice so genuine. It reminded her painfully of those nights after a battle with a villain when Deku would count her bruises and kiss them. He was in there. Her Deku was still in there. It was way too much to take in for one night. Deku was still there, but he had tried to kill not 1, but 2 of her friends, and he'd more or less declared war on Bakugu. Not to mention she'd barely slept these past 2 days. Uraraka's head fell forward against Bakugu's chest. She wasn't expecting him to do anything, but he wrapped a single arm around her loosely and pulled her against him. There were no tears from her this time. She only took a few deep shuddering breaths, taking in Bakugu's specific scent of nitroglycerin sweat and smoke. "Come on, let's get out of here," Bakugu said gruffly, pulling her towards his car where Kirishima was waiting. She glanced back at the destruction as others began to arrive. The police, reporters, a few civilians. Present Mike and Midnight were handling them now. A few turned to look her and Bakugu's way, but his scowl must have made them change their minds about approaching them. She was far too grateful. There was no way that she could face any questions right now. If the public found out that Deku had turned into a villain. No, she couldn't think about that right now. It would happen eventually, especially since he'd admitted to being behind the prison break, but Uraraka wanted to keep the public's memory of Deku pure for just one more night. Silence rested over everyone in the car like a heavy blanket as they drove the rest of the way to Ua. Even the normally talkative Ida and cheerful Kirishima had either nothing to say or were too wary to say anything at all. Despite them being in Bakugu's car, Kirishima was driving with Ida in the passenger seat. That left Uraraka, Bakugu and Tsu in the back. It wouldn't have been too uncomfortable if Bakugu hadn't been radiating anger, his entire body stiff, even his thigh pressed against hers, but honestly Uraraka was too worn down to let it bother her. He was mad that Deku had gotten away from him not once but twice tonight, and for all their careful planning Deku had still managed to get close to Uraraka. Very close. She could still remember the way it felt to be pressed back into him as he'd held her tightly and the way his thumb had caressed the bruise on her wrist. If they had been alone, he might have even gently kissed them as he had before. Her heart lurched at the thought. The kiss from the other morning still burned in her memory. "Are you sure you're all right?" Uraraka murmured to Tsu. Her friend nodded her head. "A little bruised, but nothing broken. He didn't use anywhere near his full strength to hit me. Do you think?" Uraraka bit her lip. "Do you think he held back on purpose? So that you wouldn't be hurt as much?" Tsu considered it for a moment and then shook her head. "I don't think I mattered much to him, at least in that moment, or that he didn't believe I was strong enough to require more than that. It was a sad thing to think, considering how Deku had always built them up and believed in their strength and abilities as heroes. Even worse considering how close he had been with Tsu. Compared to how he fought with Todoroki, I was a fly." Uraraka definitely didn't think that of Tsu, but fighting with Deku now that he had control over his quirk was so much different than how it had been when they were in school. He could destroy this entire city if he wanted. It was terrifying. If it came to that, she didn't know what they would do or if there was anything they could. Well, there was one thing that might stop him, but Bakugu would spontaneously combust if someone so much as hinted at it. Uraraka herself didn't know how she would react in that case. But she couldn't allow innocent people to die, especially not for her or if she could stop it. Sacrifices had to be made every day, especially in a hero's life. Upon reaching UA and sliding out of the car, Uraraka noticed Bakugu wince almost imperceptibly, but when she put a hand on his arm and gave him a look of concern, he shrugged her off. Hurt flashed across her face and he caught it before she could get rid of it. He let out an aggravated huff and his face didn't soften in the slightest, but he cupped her chin in one of his calloused hands and nodded his head, somehow letting her know with those two very brief actions that he was fine and appreciated her checking on him. All too quickly, the moment was over and he pulled his hand away, so fast it was like it never happened. She might have questioned it more had she not spotted the skeletal frame of All Might walking towards them. As soon as they connected eyes and she saw the pure pain on his face, something inside of Uraraka shattered. Deku had been more than a protege or successor to All Might. In the end, he had very much become like a son. This was worse than losing a loved one. This was something that words could not truly capture. Uraraka found herself running towards the former #1 hero until she finally crashed into him, with a little too much force probably, but he latched onto her, his absurdly long, thin arms wrapping around her and his body folding over her like a piece of paper. He might have been much physically weaker than he had been before, but she wouldn't have known that he grew weaker by the day from the way he held onto her now. Just when she thought that she was fresh out, tears pricked at her eyes and began to rush down her face. She could feel splashes of water drip on top of her head as All Might allowed tears of his own to be shed. There was a time for strength and a time for grieving. They had thought it was the former, but they had been wrong. Deku was still in there, she was certain, but watching him wrap a hand around Todoroki's throat sure made it seem like he was dead all over again. I'm so sorry, Uraraka, I'm so sorry, All Might mumbled against her, his body shaking so badly that she was surprised that she couldn't hear his bones rattling underneath his thin skin. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't any of their fault, she could hear Bakugo saying, but she recognized that All Might needed to get this out in the air. She was afraid that he believed that he might have had a hand in unleashing a monster. She didn't want him to think of Deku like that. It made the gaping wound in her heart weep further. We'll get him back, Uraraka promised as she clung to the back of his jacket. There was so much left unsaid, so much that couldn't be said, but most of it didn't need to be. He didn't even know the half of it yet, and she knew Deku's casual proclivity for violence towards his friends would cause a wound almost as damaging as the one that had taken him out of commission. He must have seen Todoroki being taken to see Recovery Girl. It was so much worse than it looked though. You had to see Deku in person to know just how horrific things were, and she desperately did not want All Might to go through that. Once they were guided inside, Uraraka found herself undeniably exhausted, but knew that the night wasn't over. She saw Aizawa watching her out of the corner of his eyes and knew that she would be questioned thoroughly before being allowed to sleep. Todoroki, Bakugo, and Tsu were being treated while Ida and Kirishima had only seen glimpses of Deku. She was the direct source, the centerpiece as far as Deku was concerned. They would have to hear it from her. She wished Bakugo was here with her. Even if he had been over the top about her protection, he'd had her back. His solid presence had made her feel stronger. Now she felt sort of alone. Uraraka. Aizawa was at her side, a hand on her shoulder. I know. Uraraka wiped her face and lifted her head. They had to get this over with. Then she could get a bit of rest before they left for the safe house. It was too dangerous to stay at UA, a place that Deku knew intimately and also housed students. Despite this being the third time, it didn't make rehashing things any easier. Still, when she sat down to tell all her former teachers about Deku, none of them interrupted her. Midnight even held her hand in a calming manner. Uraraka couldn't feel anything though. She wasn't just running on empty, she was. It was like seeing Deku tonight had drained her of everything. Like he'd taken a part of her strength with him through that warp gate. It would come back eventually, but she was worn to the bone. After shedding tears with All Might, she couldn't manage any more to save her life. When she was done, none of them spoke for a while. They seemed to realize that Uraraka was at the end of her rope and she was allowed to leave. They would talk it over amongst themselves. To be honest, she didn't think she could handle what they had to say right now. She didn't think they would be as forgiving as her. Her only issue was that she didn't know where to go, so she found herself walking to the nurse's office. It was all she could think to do. Her friends were probably there and she wanted to check on Todoroki. Right before she opened the door, it swung open to reveal Bakugo. There were circles under his eyes, but he held himself straighter. Recovery Girl must have healed his broken ribs, but it had stolen whatever little adrenaline and stamina he had left after 2 confrontations with Deku. He didn't look surprised to see her here, but he didn't move either, as if he couldn't now that she was in his sight. Seeing as how it didn't look like he was going to speak first, all Uraraka could think to say was, I came to check on Todoroki. Bakugo scoffed, but there was no heat in it. Just him? Even though she could have sworn that she didn't have it in her, the tiniest of smiles found its way on her face and she gently punched him in the chest. He acted as if it hurt him, clutching at his sides, but she knew his ribs were healed. It made her feel a little better at least. Without a word, Bakugo stepped to the side and allowed Uraraka the space to peek inside the room. She didn't go all the way in, keeping her spot in the doorway next to Bakugo. On one of the beds laid Todoroki, knocked out from his treatment by Recovery Girl. His wounds had been much more severe, especially since he'd pushed his quirk so hard. Likely he'd be out until the morning. It would aggravate him to no end. The idiot, Bakugo mumbled under his breath. He held back. Uraraka gave him a sharp look. Are you kidding me? Bakugo did not look like he was kidding even remotely. She couldn't believe him. You weren't there. The fight was... It was massive. But Bakugo simply shook his head. There should have been a lot more destruction. He should have been able to last longer. He didn't land a single hit on either Deku or Dabi. But because he held back. The downright seriousness coming from Bakugo was what got her. She had expected him to be infuriated over something like this, steaming like a pot filled with boiling water, but there was only a hard edge to his tone and a begrudging expression on his face. No scowl, no glare. You held back too, didn't you? Now there was a scowl on his face, but it wasn't directed at her or Todoroki. It was towards himself. I've never done that before. He held up his hands, palms up, and then formed them into fists. I kept telling myself, the second I see him, I'm gonna blast him to high hell, and then he was right in front of me and he looked ready to punch a wall or blow something up. Maybe both. He threatened to destroy my apartment building and kill everyone in it the second I went to make a move. He was so casual about it, but he wanted to do it. He was waiting for me to explode like usual. He knows us well, Uraraka murmured. He's one step ahead of us, just waiting for us to catch up to him and do what he wants, Bakugo growled, his fist now one of determination. And next time I see him, I'm gonna give him exactly just that. He wants to kill me? He can go ahead and try. I'll show him strong. Uraraka knew that trying to talk him out of something this mad right now was pointless. Instead she could only sigh and step back into the hallway so that he could shut the door. Todoroki was resting, so there was no sense in bothering him. Right now, all she could think about was rest. The last time she'd gotten a good night's sleep had been when she'd gone day drinking with Bakugo and he'd ended up carrying her to bed. Despite being stone-cold sober, she felt just as out of it now. You look like hell, Bakugo told her. Usually Uraraka snarked back at him when he said things like that, but at the moment, she kind of agreed with him. I feel like it too. Let's get you to bed, Bakugo said, nudging her in the direction of where she guessed they were supposed to stay for the night. I'm not carrying you again. She thought one of the teachers might have told her, but she'd been so distracted by her mental and physical exhaustion that she couldn't remember. It was a good thing Bakugo had been paying more attention. All she could think about right now was a bed and the look on Deku's face when he'd saved her. It didn't match up at all with how Deku had looked when he'd told Bakugo that he was going to enjoy killing him. Just the thought of Deku saying that in front of everyone stilled Uraraka's feet. Bakugo! He stopped and turned around to face her, a faint questioning look on his face. I'm scared. Bakugo gazed at her and then simply said, then use that fear to fuel that fire because I can guarantee that you're gonna need it, before turning back and continuing down the hallway. All she could do was follow him and believe in her heart that she could do what he said. It was all any of them could do. The room they finally entered had a few beds made up in it. Sue, Ida, and Kirishima were already there. Sue and Kirishima had been conversing quietly while Ida was on the phone with his back to them. As soon as Bakugo opened the door, the two facing towards the door waved them over and Bakugo and Uraraka made their way over to them. How's Todoroki? Sue immediately asked. Recovery girl fixed him up, Uraraka told her. Bakugo plopped down next to Kirishima. He'll be fine by the morning. No need to worry over him. The four of them fell into silence. Uraraka couldn't help but hear Ida talking on the phone. It sounded like he was on the phone with someone from their class, but she couldn't be for sure who. She figured it was either Momo or Kaminari, both who had the best resources at contacting people. One thing for sure was that he sounded like he was still carrying on well, powering through this whole thing, but she saw the way he kept clenching and unclenching his left hand. He'd had it fixed 2 years ago, but Uraraka remembered it as being the one that he'd injured while fighting Stain the hero killer alongside Deku and Todoroki. Kirishima suddenly piped up. I believed you, Uraraka, I did. But seeing Midoriya like that tonight? He rubbed at his eyes. What are we supposed to do? He was scary, Sue added. It was like he was playing with Todoroki. Bakugo folded his arms across his chest. He wouldn't have been playing had Icy Hot gone all out like he was supposed to. Sue shot Bakugo a look, which he ignored, but said nothing. She had seen the way Todoroki had fought against the villains. To them, it had looked like nothing short of a miracle that he was still alive. Then again, now that Uraraka thought about it, she had seen Todoroki cause much more damage before. Had he held back because he had been concerned about collateral damage or because it was Deku? What was it that Todoroki had said right before Aizawa had shown up and cancelled both their quirks? Don't make me do it, Izuku. What had they expected? None of them wanted to truly fight Deku, and not just because he was insanely powerful. Just as he had been at school, he wasn't giving them a choice, forcing them to come at him with their all. She was afraid that it still wouldn't be good enough. This wasn't some lesson that would help better them as heroes in the future. It was a hard punch in the gut that made their knees buckles and took their breath away. He used to do that for her before. In the morning as he left for work, the door open and the sun shining on him, his green hair an utter mess no matter what he did, the smattering of freckles on his face that would never leave, and that big beam on his face that told her everything was going to be all right. She had loved him so much in those little moments. Part of her still wanted to love him now. They all did in their own way, even Bakugo, who might not have liked Deku, but had done everything he could to save her as Deku would have wanted. They didn't want to do this. None of them. But they had to. He left them no choice. Uraraka watched with thinly veiled frustration as Momo and Hatsum went about their business throughout the safe house. As far as safe houses were concerned, it could have been cleaner, but Uraraka wasn't certain that Aizawa didn't use this place to hide off the grid and just sleep. It had little in the way of defenses or surveillance systems, which was where the two other girls came in handy. The sort of tech needed was Hatsum's style, and Momo alone, outside of Kaminari, was able to help her. All in all, it made Uraraka feel like she was being babysat, which she loathed. Hatsum dropped down onto the couch next to her, ignoring the way it sank uncomfortably to the middle. It was probably older than them. All done. I don't sell this kind tech very often, so it's good to be of service. Everyone is so focused on the offensive these days. Though none of the same equipment, it reminded Uraraka of the tech they'd used during the cavalry battle at their first sports festival. They'd used defensive stuff then, like the jetpack and blasters on her boots. As a pro hero, those blasters were an integral part of her costume, allowing her to navigate the air whenever she used her quirk on herself. It had come in handy so many times. Hatsum always updated them for free, claiming that Uravity wearing her gear gave her enough commissions just from the publicity. Still, it made Uraraka nervous, Hatsum leaving her obvious mark on the safe house. If Deku found the place, and to be honest, she did not doubt he would somehow, he would know that Hatsum had had a hand in helping hide Uraraka away from him. It was a target on another friend's back, placed there because of her. All her friends were willing to risk their lives, that was what heroes did, but this was different and they all knew it. They would have had to fight Deku regardless if he was fixated on her or not, but this just made it worse. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this, Hatsum," Uraraka said, staring down at her hands in her lap. Hatsum smiled softly. "I would have dragged my own but into it eventually. You know how nosy I am." She wasn't flippant in the way that Todoroki had been. Uraraka knew that Hatsum was devastated by the news of what had become of Deku. He had done a lot to help her make a name for herself in the hero support world, always telling reporters about her new tech or pointing her tech out while on live television. That had been the kind of day-to-day hero that he was, the kind that went out of his way for his friends because he simply enjoyed it. "I'm not sure how much good it will do," Hatsum sighed, "but it's better than nothing." She shook her head. "I can't believe that Aizawa used this as a safe house. It's practically just bones." "It has been a while since he's used it as one apparently," Uraraka pointed out, though why she felt the need to defend it or her former teacher, she had no idea. "It's pretty reclusive at least." "It's shit," Bakugo interjected from his spot by the window. Hatsum folded her arms across her chest. "Don't you go insulting my babies." "I did what I could." Bakugo folded his arms and made a scoffing sound, but didn't say anything. They'd all seen her gear in action before and some of it was wild. Didn't mean he thought it would amount to much stacked up against Deku. "I bet you won't say that to Aizawa's face." "I did," Bakugo threw back like a rock, "and I will again." Before Uraraka could berate him for being so critical, she was certain that he would only be pleased if she was halfway across the world in a bunker. The door opened and Todoroki stepped inside. His movements seemed a tad more languid than usual, but other than that he appeared absolutely normal, as if he hadn't been slammed hard into a wall twice or fought for his life. Uraraka had only managed to say, "Todoroki, are you?" before Bakugo cut in with, "He would be if he'd fucking done what he was told." There wasn't a single reaction from Todoroki, as if he either hadn't heard Bakugo or it didn't affect him. He'd barely managed to shut the door before Bakugo rounded on him, grabbing him by the collar of his pro-hero costume and slamming him against the door. Both Hatsum and Uraraka jumped to their feet, the latter exclaiming, "Bakug?" But of course he didn't listen. Todoroki was freshly healed from his fight with Deku, and here was Bakugo doing the same damn thing. It was slightly jarring. Even though the door made a banging sound, it wasn't anywhere near as hard as Deku had done to Todoroki. It wasn't enough to hurt, just to get a point across, and Bakugo looked like had a list of them. "You fucking held back, you idiot," Bakugo snarled in his face. He was holding Todoroki against the door, but not pushing him into it. If Todoroki wanted, it wouldn't take much to knock Bakugo away, but he didn't. He stood there and took all of Bakugo's rage head-on without so much as blinking. "You told me that you wouldn't let that bastard get close to her." He was close enough to where he had to save her from getting deep-fried by Dabi. His red eyes glared furiously into Todoroki's mismatched ones, but there wasn't hate in his eyes like there used to be. "I should have been there." There was nothing but an impassive expression on Todoroki's face as he said, "Don't pretend that seeing him like that didn't affect you either." Bakugo made a growling sound, but Uraraka knew that Todoroki was right since Bakugo had basically told her that he had froze as well. Seeing Deku like that had a polarizing effect on a person. It was so wrong that it almost seemed more reasonable to believe that he had an evil twin running around. She could see Deku in there, but then it wasn't like she was looking at two people at the same time. "I won't let that happen again," Bakugo swore. "Neither will I," Todoroki said. Bakugo narrowed his eyes. "You better make damn certain you don't, because if Deku doesn't kill you, I will." He let go of Todoroki's shirt and took a step back. "We can't afford to be weak or fight half-heartedly when he's going to come at us with everything." "He hasn't already?" Momo asked as she stepped into the room, her worried gaze landing on Todoroki. "Not by a long shot," Bakugo said. His eyes swept over them until they landed on Uraraka. For once, she couldn't read what was in them. Was it fear? Anticipation? She couldn't be for certain. He turned away from her and opened the front door to walk out. "We'll know when he does. It's going to be ugly. And I, for one, am not going to stand by and let him get away with it. I don't care what's wrong with his head. It'll still be done by his hands." The door slamming shut echoed in Uraraka's ears for at least 3 seconds, matching the loud beat of her heart. None of them spoke, if only because they knew he was right. Momo and Hatsum looked a little less sure, but they hadn't seen Deku in action. Even Uraraka had questioned it before seeing Deku fight Todoroki. She'd thought that she knew what was happening, but a small part of her had kept whispering that it couldn't be that bad. Deku couldn't be evil. The second it came to fighting one of his best friends, surely he'd snap out of it. But he hadn't. As he had done everything before, Deku went in with all his heart. Part of her was worried that he hadn't killed Todoroki because he wanted to fight him again. "Someone's gotta stick up their ass," Hatsum grumbled. "He's right," Todoroki sighed, looking down at his feet. "I did hesitate. I told myself I wouldn't, that I would use everything in me to keep Deku from Uraraka, but I couldn't do it." Momo laid a hand on his arm. "That's not your fault. Any of us would have reacted that way." "We can't do that anymore," Todoroki insisted. "We're not children. We're pro-heroes and they do not hesitate in combat." "I doubt pro-heroes have to fight their formerly dead friends," Hatsum offered. They were all valid points. Even now, if faced with Deku on her own, Uraraka wasn't sure if she could take him on full throttle. She didn't have the kind of quirk like Todoroki, Bakugo, or Deku did. Her quirk couldn't easily kill just as much as it could save. When they fought, they had to consider their quirk a little more carefully, so as to make sure that they didn't take a life. They had been taught to refrain alongside strengthening their quirk. When Todoroki turned to Uraraka and gave her a brief bow, she blinked at him in surprise. But his words, "I'm sorry for failing you," had her raising both her eyebrows. "Todoroki, you did nothing of the kind," Uraraka told him. His eyes were tired and sad when he gazed at her, the eyes of someone who had lost a friend. She'd seen him wear them before, it upset her now just as much. "It was harder than I anticipated, seeing him, and I expect it will only get worse. If the League told him to take Bakugo and I out of the way, that means they're planning something. I let my personal feelings get in the way of our objective." Knowing that this was a battle she could not win, Uraraka nodded her head. Just don't let it happen again. She put on a brave smile. He needed it. They all did. Everyone was acting like she might break at any minute, but right now, she was tired of that. She had to take care of the others too. I won't always be there to jump in and save you. A shame, Todoroki replied. I expect such things of you, Ravity. It wasn't nearly enough to bridge the pain they shared. Uraraka knew that it would be a long time before Todoroki admitted just how much he'd been hurt by Deku. Not by his fists, but by his words and behavior. His grief would turn to fuel later on, but for now he was forcing himself to hang in the middle of a fog, as if he could block out everything he felt. She could understand that. Sometimes you had to push your emotions away to get the job done. Hadn't she done that back in the day about her feelings for Deku? They'd been such kids then, even if they had been forced to deal with horrific things. She hadn't known that those feelings would eventually lead her to this. She wasn't quite sure what she would have done had she known. The mere thought of giving up the many beautiful memories she'd shared with Deku made her terribly sad. She didn't want to give those up or have them replaced by the Deku of now.